The scalpel in my hand was completely dull, but the young veteran, choking on his own blood, had less than 15 seconds before his brain starved for oxygen. I stood in the harsh, flickering neon glow of Emergency Bay 4 at the St. Jude VA Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. It was 3:12 a.m. Outside, a torrential Texas rain hammered against the reinforced glass windows, blurring the highway lights into long, smeared streaks of amber and red. To the rest of the night shift staff, I was just Dr. Clara Vance, a quiet, unremarked general practitioner who took every overnight shift nobody else wanted, who never spoke at departmental meetings, and who slipped out the back exit before the morning sun ever touched the parking lot. They thought I was ordinary. They thought I was forgettable by choice. They had no idea that these same hands had reconstructed shattered chests in flooded triage tents while mortar shells tore through the desert air, in places the United States Navy would never admit we had ever been. If you enjoy immersive military and medical stories like this, please subscribe to Emergency Heroes Stories, and take a moment to drop a comment below, letting me know where in the world you're listening from right now. The bay smelled of cold floor wax, industrial disinfectant, and the sharp copper tang of arterial blood. On the gurney before me lay Marcus Reyes, a 24-year-old former Army specialist. He had come in for a routine checkup on an old shrapnel site near his shoulder, but an undiagnosed tracheal tear had suddenly ruptured, trapped air collapsing his airway in a matter of seconds. Beside me, Dr. Timmy Miller, a 28-year-old second-year resident whose scrub top was already soaked in cold sweat, was completely paralyzed. His hands hovered over the emergency tray, trembling so violently that the stainless steel instruments rattled like dry bones. "His oxygen saturation is 72%, Timmy shouted, his voice cracking into a high, panicked register that echoed off the tile walls. I can't see the vocal cords. The tissue is completely swollen. We need an intubation tray. We need senior attending. We need—" "Quiet," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the low, flat frequency of a tactical command. "Step back, Timmy. Dr. Vance, we can't perform a surgical airway without a clear field. Hospital protocol explicitly states—" I didn't answer him. I didn't have time to explain that protocols were written for clean, brightly lit operating rooms by administrators who had never seen a man suffocate in the mud. I grabbed a standard number 11 blade from the tray. The blade was old, part of a discounted shipment the hospital had acquired to cut quarterly expenses, and located the cricothyroid membrane by touch alone. My index finger slid over Marcus's throat, feeling the subtle anatomical landmarks through the swelling tissue. It was a tactile precision that couldn't be learned from textbook diagrams. It was built through dozens of frantic procedures performed under blackout conditions in forward operating bases. "Hold his head," I ordered Timmy. "Dr. Vance, if you nick the carotid, hold his head now." Timmy locked his hands onto Marcus's temples, his knuckles turning stark white. Marcus's eyes were rolled back, his chest making terrible, dry, convulsive heaves as his body fought for air that couldn't reach his lungs. I made the incision in a single, fluid motion. One swift transverse cut through the skin, then a firm, precise push through the membrane. The dull blade resisted for a fraction of a second, but I drove it through with exact, calculated pressure. A sharp, loud hiss of trapped air escaped the wound, spraying a fine mist of blood across my latex gloves. Before the tissue could collapse back on itself, I grabbed a sterile ballpoint pen tube I had prepped on the tray, snapped off the casing, and inserted it directly into the trachea. Marcus's chest expanded violently. He drew in a deep, shuddering gasp of oxygen, the cardiac monitor instantly shifting from a frantic, high-pitched scream back into a steady, rhythmic beep. His oxygen saturation began to climb. 78, 84, 92%. Timmy let out a long, ragged breath, staggering back against the supply cart. He stared at me, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses, looking at my face as if he were seeing me for the very first time. 12 seconds, he whispered, his voice trembling. "You just did a field cricothyroidotomy in 12 seconds with a dull scalpel. Where the hell did you learn to do that?" I didn't answer. I reached for a roll of medical tape to secure the tube, my movements deliberate and economical. "Get a portable ventilator set up and notify the ICU," I said, stripping off my bloody gloves. "He's stable for transfer." Before Timmy could ask another question, The double doors of Emergency Bay 4 slammed open with a heavy metallic clang. Dr. Arthur Pendleton stood in the doorway. 54 years old, wearing a crisp, tailored lab coat over a $1,000 suit, the surgical director of St. Jude VA Medical Center looked less like a doctor and more like a corporate raider looking for assets to liquidate. His silver hair was perfectly combed despite the hour, and his thin lips were set in a hard, disapproving line. For 3 years, Pendleton had run St. Jude like his personal fiefdom. He was a man who measured hospital success not by lives saved, but by cost-cutting metrics, quarterly profit margins, and his standing with the regional medical board. He had built his entire reputation on stripping away resources from frontline staff, while ruthlessly punishing anyone who dared to question his authority. He stepped into the room, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. His eyes swept over the blood-spattered gurney, the makeshift airway tube, and finally landed on me. "What in God's name is going on here?" Pendleton's voice was smooth, cold, and dripping with immediate disdain. Timmy stepped forward, still breathing heavily. "Dr. Pendleton, the patient had an acute upper airway obstruction. Dr. Vance just saved his life. She performed an emergency." "I can see what she performed, Dr. Miller." Pendleton cut him off without looking at him. He took 2 steps toward me, invading my personal space, his tall frame looming over me. "Dr. Vance, you performed an invasive, high-risk surgical procedure in a standard emergency bay without an anesthesiologist present, without prior imaging, and without authorization from the attending surgical chief." I met his gaze directly, my expression entirely neutral. "The patient had a complete airway collapse, Dr. Pendleton. He would have suffered irreversible brain damage in under 30 seconds. Imaging would have taken 15 minutes. Protocols exist for a reason, Doctor." "Vance!" Pendleton's voice rose, filling the bay with a sharp, echoing snap. "This hospital operates under strict clinical guidelines established by the administration. You are a general practitioner hired to handle routine night shift admissions and basic triage. You are not a trauma surgeon here. You do not make executive clinical calls on invasive procedures. I did what was necessary to keep the patient breathing," I said quietly. Pendleton sneered, stepping even closer. His eyes narrowed as he looked at my hands that were perfectly steady, showing not the slightest tremor of adrenaline. He had seen hundreds of young doctors after an emergency procedure. Their knees shook, their voices quavered, their eyes darted around seeking approval. But I just stood there, my posture relaxed, my weight balanced evenly, observing him the way a scout observes an enemy patrol. "Look at you," Pendleton muttered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous tone meant to humiliate. "No remorse, no respect for the chain of command. You act like you own this floor. I've been reviewing your employment file, Dr. Vance. Dr. Clara Vance, graduated mid-pack from a state medical school, 2 years of rural general practice, no surgical residency listed on your public record. Yet you handle a scalpel with the arrogance of a chief of surgery." "I handle a scalpel with the intention of keeping people alive," I replied. "You handle it like someone who thinks they are above the law." Pendleton snapped back. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the stale scent of black coffee. "I don't care what backwoods clinic you crawled out of before you took this shift. At St. Jude, you follow my rules. You do not improvise. You do not play the hero." He turned his back on me, grabbing Marcus Reyes's chart from the end of the bed and signing his name across the bottom in broad, aggressive strokes. "Dr. Miller," Pendleton commanded without looking up, "clean up this mess and transfer the patient to the 3rd floor. And make sure the incident report notes that Dr. Vance performed an unauthorized surgical intervention." "Dr. Pendleton, respectfully," Timmy began, his face flushing red. "That is an order, Doctor." "Miller!" Pendleton shouted, turning back to glare at the young resident until Timmy dropped his head and nodded silently. Pendleton then looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Dr. Vance, my office, first thing after morning shift turnover. We are going to have a very detailed discussion about your future at this facility." He turned on his heel and walked out, his lab coat billowing behind him like a sail. The room fell completely silent again, save for the steady beep of the cardiac monitor and the heavy rustle of the rain against the glass. Timmy looked at me with a mixture of profound awe and deep, hopeless sympathy. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vance," he murmured. He's destroyed doctors for less than this. Dr. Arisby questioned his budget cut 6 months ago, and Pendleton had his license suspended within a week. "Don't apologize, Timmy," I said, reaching for a fresh pair of gloves to finish cleaning the sterile field. "Focus on the patient." I worked through the rest of the night in silence. At 5:45 a.m., I walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor on the second floor toward the staff break room. The walls were lined with faded photographs of military generals, hospital board members, and corporate donors, all men in expensive suits or heavily decorated dress uniforms, smiling down at an empty hallway. I sat at the small laminate table in the corner of the break room, holding a paper cup of tepid, bitter coffee that had been sitting in the pot for 3 hours. Through the small window, the Texas sky was just beginning to shift from deep black to a bruised, violet gray. I had chosen St. Jude VA Medical Center precisely because it was forgotten. It was an aging, underfunded facility situated right between military bases, treating elderly veterans and low-income active-duty families. It was the kind of place where a doctor could slip into the night shift, do her job, and never have her name spoken in the hallways of power. For 3 years, I had carefully cultivated my invisibility. I took no vacation days, applied for no promotions, attended no hospital galas, and parked my old sedan in the furthest corner of the staff lot where no security cameras pointed. I had to stay invisible. Because 3 years ago, in a classified medical bunker outside Latakia, Syria, I had been Commander Clara Vance, Chief Trauma Surgeon for Naval Special Warfare Development Group. And in that bunker, when a corrupt Joint Task Force commander ordered me to abandon 4 critically wounded Navy SEALs to cover up a botched illegal intelligence operation, I had refused his direct order. I stayed behind under heavy fire, performed 4 emergency thoracotomies while the building collapsed around us, and brought every single one of those men home alive. The Navy rewarded my insubordination by stripping my rank, sealing my military medical records under a top-secret classification, and burying my career beneath a mountain of manufactured bureaucratic lies. They gave me a choice: accept a quiet, off-the-record discharge and live as a ghost, or fight them in a closed-door court-martial and spend 20 years in a military brig. I chose to survive. I changed my middle name, scrubbed my public profile, and disappeared into the shadows of night shift medicine. The door to the break room creaked open, interrupting my thoughts. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stepped inside. She was 42 years old, a former Air Force medic with tired eyes and a heart that carried too much of the floor's suffering. She carried a stack of fresh linens, but when she saw me, she stopped and set them on the counter. "Word travels fast," Sarah said softly, taking a seat across from me. "Timmy told the nursing station what happened in Bay 4. You saved that kid's life, Clara." "Pendleton didn't see it that way," I noted, taking a sip of the cold coffee. "Pendleton doesn't see patients as human beings," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He sees them as line items on a spreadsheet. Clara, you need to be careful. He went straight from Bay 4 to the administrative wing. He pulled your personnel file. I saw him talking to HR on his phone." I looked at her, my face unreadable. "Let him look." "You don't understand," Sarah urged, leaning forward, her eyes filled with genuine panic. "Pendleton isn't just a bad boss. He's connected. His brother-in-law is a senior director on the hospital board, and he sits on the Regional Advisory Committee for military health contracts. When someone crosses him, he doesn't just fire them. He makes sure their credentials get flagged for clinical incompetence nationwide. You won't be able to get a job sweeping floors in a clinic if he targets you." "I appreciate the warning, Sarah," I said gently. "Really, I do." "Then why aren't you afraid?" she asked, searching my face with intense curiosity. "I've seen decorated combat medics shake like leaves when Pendleton calls them into his office. But you look like you're just waiting for a train." Before I could answer, the overhead speakers throughout the entire hospital suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't the standard soft chime of an internal page. It was 3 sharp, high-decibel electronic blasts, a sound I hadn't heard in 3 years, a sound reserved exclusively for military mass casualty events and Tier 1 emergency protocols. Beep, beep, beep. The static cleared, and the voice of the chief administrative operator echoed through the building. trembling with an unmistakable raw panic. Code Black. All senior medical staff, repeat. All senior medical staff report to Trauma Bay 1 immediately. Command authority active. This is not a drill. I repeat. Code Black in Trauma Bay 1. Sarah stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floorboards. Code Black? We haven't had a Code Black here in 5 years. That's only for... She stopped. Through the high windows of the break room, the gray morning sky was suddenly split by the deafening, thunderous roar of heavy military rotor blades. I walked to the window and looked down. Sweeping in low over the perimeter fence were 3 massive, dark gray Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters, their rotors whipping the rain into a blinding hurricane of white spray across the hospital's helipad. Surrounding the perimeter of the pad were 4 blacked-out SUVs, their emergency strobes flashing amber and blue. Armed men in full tactical gear, carrying short-barreled carbines and wearing unmarked plate carriers, swarmed out of the vehicles, establishing a perimeter around the helipad in under 10 seconds. This wasn't a civilian transport. This wasn't even a standard VA emergency. This was a high-level military extraction team landing in the middle of a civilian hospital. My God, Sarah whispered, her face going completely pale as she pressed her hands against the glass. What is happening down there? I watched as the side door of the lead Blackhawk slid open. A team of 4 military medics scrambled out, carrying a heavy tactical gurney wrapped in military-grade heating blankets and monitoring lines. Standing right beside the gurney, directing the team with furious hand gestures, was a man in immaculate Navy service dress blues. His collar bore the silver eagle of a Navy captain, his face drawn tight with absolute, desperate terror. On the gurney lay a man. Even from 2 stories up, through the heavy rain, I could see the thick gold braid on the shoulder boards of the uniform jacket draped over his bloodied chest. 4 silver stars. A 4-star general. My heart gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. In the military hierarchy, a 4-star general is a god. They do not get treated at local VA hospitals. They get flown directly to Walter Reed or San Diego Naval Medical Center under armed fighter escort. For a 4-star general to be brought to an underfunded, aging facility like St. Jude, it meant only one thing. He was dying so fast that his transport couldn't survive another 10 minutes in the air. Below us, the emergency bay doors burst open, and Dr. Arthur Pendleton ran out onto the wet asphalt, flanked by 2 senior attending surgeons. Pendleton was bowing his head against the rotor wash, his face lit up with an expression of frantic, opportunistic excitement. I could see it in his eyes even from the window. This was his moment. Saving a 4-star general at his facility would guarantee his promotion, lock in his board seat, and bring millions in federal funding to St. Jude. Clara, Sarah said, her voice shaking violently as she pulled on her coat. We need to get down there. They're going to need every nurse on the floor. Go ahead, I said, my eyes still locked on the tactical gurney as it disappeared through the automatic doors of Trauma Bay 1. I'll be right behind you. As Sarah rushed out of the break room, I stood alone by the window for a moment longer. The cold rain splashed against the glass, reflecting my blurred image. I knew what was coming down those hallways. I knew the chaos, the blood, the impossible pressure of a room filled with armed guards and screaming monitors. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Dr. Arthur Pendleton was about to walk into a nightmare he was completely unprepared to handle. I turned around, unbuttoned my plain white lab coat, and tossed it over the back of the chair. Underneath, I wore my standard dark navy scrubs. I rolled up my sleeves, revealing the faint, pale surgical scar running along my inner right forearm. A souvenir from a night in Syria where I had learned that saving a life was worth breaking every rule ever written. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the break room, and walked steadily toward the sound of the screaming alarms. The main corridor leading to Trauma Bay 1 looked like a war zone in the middle of a hospital. Armed naval guards in dark tactical gear had already established a hard perimeter, their eyes scanning every doctor, nurse, and orderly who approached. Cold rain and the smell of aviation fuel drifted in through the wide emergency doors, mixing with the sharp smell of antiseptics and fear. I walked past the security line with my hands kept low and visible. The tactical guards didn't stop me. They were too focused on securing the outer exits and maintaining a perimeter for the 4-star arrival. Inside Trauma Bay 1, the atmosphere was suffocating. The room was huge, built for major resuscitation, but it felt tiny with 12 people crowded around the central gurney. Overhead, surgical lamps cast a blinding yellow light on the bloody scene below. The monitors were already chirping in rapid, alarming tones, a cardiac rhythm hovering dangerously high at 140 beats per minute, while the blood pressure monitor read a devastating 70/40. Dr. Arthur Pendleton stood at the head of the bed. His tailored suit jacket was off, thrown carelessly onto a supply cart, and his crisp white shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. He was barked orders, his voice carrying that familiar sharp edge of authority, but his eyes were wide, darting nervously between the primary monitor and the patient's gray, saturated face. "Get me 4 units of O-negative on the rapid infuser now!" Pendleton shouted, pointing aggressively at a young nurse who was struggling to spike an IV bag. "Set up the central line kit. Where is the chest tray? Why isn't the chest tray ready?" Standing directly across from Pendleton was the Navy captain I had seen from the break room window. His name tag read Vance, but there was no time to process the coincidence. His navy blues were soaked with rain and dark, drying blood across the chest. His face was rigid, his jaw set so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. "Listen to me, Doctor," Captain Vance said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying growl that cut right through Pendleton's panic. "General Marcus Vance took a high-velocity fragment to the upper chest 40 minutes ago during a transport failure over the Gulf. He has lost at least 2 liters of blood. If you cannot stabilize his subclavian vessel in the next 5 minutes, he dies on this table." Pendleton wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, leaving a streak of red across his brow. "Captain, I am the surgical director of this facility. I have performed hundreds of vascular repairs. I need you and your armed detail to step back behind the curtain and let my team work." "You have 3 minutes before his heart stops, Doctor," Captain Vance replied, coldness, not moving an inch. "Do not tell me to step back." I stood near the supply cabinets at the back of the bay, watching Pendleton's hands. He reached for a pair of sterile gloves, but his fingers were trembling so badly he missed the opening twice. He was trying to hide it, pulling the latex tight with a loud snap, but I knew the signs. I had seen it in young combat medics during their first firefight in Helmand. It wasn't just stress. It was the sudden, overwhelming realization that he was out of his depth. Pendleton was a master of hospital politics, administrative budget cuts, and intimidating junior staff in quiet hallways. But face-to-face with a catastrophic arterial tear on a 4-star general, under the cold glare of the United States Navy, his polished armor was cracking. Pendleton stepped up to the patient, grabbing a pair of heavy trauma shears to cut away the remainder of the general's shirt. The wound was horrific. A jagged 3-inch laceration sat just below the left clavicle, pumping thick, dark red blood in heavy, rhythmic surges that pooled instantly in the hollow of the man's neck. "Give me a suction catheter and a vascular clamp," Pendleton demanded, his voice strained. Dr. Timmy Miller, who had just rushed into the room carrying a tray of arterial clamps, handed the instrument over with shaking hands. Pendleton plunged the suction tip deep into the wound, trying to clear the field, but the blood rose faster than the machine could draw it out. The bright red pool spilled over the sides of the chest, running down the general's ribs and soaking into the white bedsheets. "I can't see the origin of the bleed," Pendleton yelled, his composure breaking entirely. "The field is flooded. I need more suction. Get another unit in here." "You're probing blindly, Doctor." "Pendleton," I said quietly from the back of the room. My voice wasn't raised, but in the tense, silent intervals between the monitor beeps, everyone heard it. Pendleton's head snapped toward me. His face flushed a deep, angry purple. "What are you doing in here, Dr. Vance?" "I explicitly told you to report to my office after turnover. This is an active trauma resuscitation for a high-priority patient. Get out." I didn't move. I kept my posture grounded, my hands relaxed at my sides. The subclavian artery is retracted beneath the clavicle bone. If you blindly clamp in that pool of blood, you're going to crush the brachial plexus nerve or tear the vein completely. He will bleed out in 90 seconds. I know how to manage a vascular laceration." Pendleton roared, his voice cracking with rage and hidden terror. "You are a low-level triage doctor. You have no standing in this room. Guards, remove this woman immediately." 2 of the armed Navy guards stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, but Captain Vance held up a single gloved hand. The guards froze instantly. Captain Vance turned his sharp blue eyes on me. He looked at my face, then down at my hands, and finally at the absolute, unshakable calm in my posture. He was a veteran officer. He knew the difference between panic disguised as authority and the quiet, dangerous confidence of someone who had lived through hell. "Who are you?" Captain Vance asked, his voice low and searching. "Dr. Clara Vance," I answered, meeting his gaze directly. "General surgery." Pendleton spat out a bitter, desperate laugh. "She's an insubordinate GP, Captain. She performed an unauthorized, dangerous procedure on a veteran 2 hours ago. I am in the middle of initiating formal disciplinary proceedings to revoke her credentials. She has no surgical privileges in this hospital." "I don't care about your administrative paperwork, Doctor," Captain Vance said, turning back to Pendleton with utter contempt. "Look at your patient." The primary monitor shifted its tone. The rapid beeping began to slow down, dropping precipitously. 90, 75, 60 beats per minute. The blood pressure line on the digital display flattened out into a terrifying, steady decline. 50/20. "He's going into profound hemorrhagic shock," Timmy cried out, grabbing the sides of the gurney. "VFib imminent. We're losing his pulse." Pendleton plunged the vascular clamp back into the bloody cavity, making a wild, blind snatch at the tissue beneath the collarbone. A violent spurt of bright, arterial blood sprayed directly across his face and the front of his white shirt. He recoiled, dropping the clamp onto the floor with a metallic clatter. His hands hovered over the open wound, dripping red, completely frozen. I can't find the vessel," Pendleton whispered, his voice stripped of all arrogance, leaving only raw, pathetic panic. "The tissue is too torn. We need to transfer him to an operating suite. We need a vascular specialist." "He won't survive the elevator ride to the 3rd floor," I said, stepping past the frozen Navy guards and walking directly to the scrub sink at the side of the bay. Pendleton looked at me with hollow, terrified eyes as I turned on the taps with my elbows. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten my job. He just stood there, his chest heaving, his hands dripping blood onto the floor, completely broken by the reality of his own incompetence. I scrubbed my hands and forearms with iodine in 20 seconds flat, my mind shifting into a familiar, cold gear. The noise of the room faded into the background. The flashing lights, Pendleton's heavy breathing, the heavy rain outside. It all compressed into a single, sharp point of focus. I had been in this exact darkness 100 times before. I pulled on a pair of sterile surgical gloves from the wall rack, pulling the latex tight over my fingers with a sharp snap. "Timmy," I commanded, stepping up to the left side of the gurney. "Get a rib spreader and a sterile vascular tourniquet from the emergency tray. Stand right there and hold the suction tip exactly where I tell you. Do not move unless I tell you to move." Yes, Dr. Vance," Timmy stammered, instantly snapping out of his daze and grabbing the instruments. Pendleton took a slow, staggering step back from the bed, his back hitting the cold metal of the supply cabinet. He stared at me with a mixture of burning hatred and utter disbelief. "You can't do this, Clara. If he dies under your hands, I will make sure you are prosecuted for manslaughter. I will destroy every piece of your life." I didn't even look at him. "Step away from the sterile field, Dr. Pendleton. You're in my way." I reached into the bloody cavity of the general's chest with my left hand. The tissue was cold, slick with losing life. I ignored the pool of dark blood filling the space and slid my index and middle fingers beneath the shattered clavicle bone, relying entirely on tactile memory. I felt the jagged edge of the bone fragment, the soft swell of the damaged muscle, and then, deep against the first rib, the hard, frantic spurting of the severed subclavian artery. With millimeter precision, I compressed the vessel against the bone with my fingertips. The heavy, rushing sound of bleeding stopped instantly. The flooded field cleared as Timmy applied the suction tip to the remaining blood. On the overhead monitor, the terrifying downward spiral of the general's heart rate stabilized at 45 beats per minute. He was still on the edge of death, but the faucet was turned off. Captain Vance stepped closer to the head of the bed, his eyes fixed on my hands buried deep inside the general's chest. He let out a long, slow breath, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. Pendleton, standing by the back wall, watched the blood stop with a pale, twisted expression. His authority was gone. His dominance over the floor was shattered in front of his staff and the United States Navy. But as he looked at me, a simple night shift doctor holding a 4-star general's life together with 2 fingers, a new, dark calculation appeared in his eyes. He realized that if I failed now, if the general died on this table, he could pin the entire catastrophic failure on my unauthorized intervention. Pendleton straightened his posture slightly, pulling a fresh handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the blood off his face. His voice returned, lower this time, filled with a quiet, venomous malice. You've temporarily stopped the bleed, Dr. Vance, but you can't hold that artery with your fingers forever. You can't operate in an emergency bay. And as surgical director, I am officially denying you access to the main operating suites. Timmy looked up in sheer horror. Dr. Pendleton, she's keeping him alive. She is an uncredentialed general practitioner operating outside her scope. Pendleton snapped, his eyes locking onto mine with cold victory. Hospital policy is absolute. No unapproved staff member enters the OR suites without my explicit written authorization. You want to play the surgeon, Clara? You can stand right there until his heart stops. The room went dead silent again. Timmy looked like he had been slapped. The nurses froze. Pendleton stood there with his arms crossed, using the very bureaucracy he controlled to trap me, willing to let the man on the table die just to ensure my destruction. I kept my fingers locked firmly on the spurting vessel, my eyes fixed on Pendleton's sneering face. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to, because behind Pendleton, the heavy double doors of Trauma Bay 1 swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. A young Navy communications officer stepped into the room, his face pale, holding a secure satellite tablet in his trembling hand. He ignored Pendleton completely and walked straight up to Captain Vance. "Sir," the young officer whispered, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Priority 1 transmission from the Pentagon. It's the Joint Chiefs. They are on the line for the attending chief." Pendleton's face instantly lit up. He smoothed down his blood-stained shirt, taking a confident step forward toward the officer, extending his hand for the tablet. "Give that to me. I am Dr. Arthur Pendleton, Surgical Director of St. Jude." Captain Vance intercepted Pendleton with a single heavy forearm to the chest, shoving the director backward so hard Pendleton nearly stumbled into the sink. Captain Vance grabbed the tablet, tapped the screen, and placed it on speakerphone. A deep, gravelly voice, heavy with decades of absolute military command, blasted out of the tablet's speaker, filling every corner of the trauma bay. "This is General Thomas Sterling, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I am speaking to the medical lead at St. Jude VA. We have just received confirmation that Commander Clara Vance is currently on site in your facility." "Is Commander Vance present?" Pendleton froze mid-step, his mouth hanging open, his eyes darting frantically between the tablet and me. "Commander Vance?" He stammered out loud, his voice barely a squeak. There is no Commander Vance here. We only have a Dr. Clara Vance, a general practitioner who is currently under administrative suspension." "Shut your mouth, civilian." The voice from the Pentagon roared through the speaker, cutting Pendleton down like a scythe. "I don't give a damn about your hospital's administrative garbage. If Commander Clara Vance is in that room, put her on the line right now." Captain Vance held the tablet close to my face. I stood over the bloody gurney, my left hand buried deep inside the general's chest, my right hand steady at my side. I looked at the tablet, then at Pendleton's ghostly white face. "This is Commander Clara Vance, General," I said, my voice calm, clear, and dripping with authority. "I have my fingers on General Vance's subclavian artery. He is stabilized, but I need an operating suite immediately." The gravelly voice from the Joint Chiefs responded without a single second of hesitation. "Commander Vance, by order of the United States Department of Defense and the Executive Office, I am placing St. Jude VA Medical Center under emergency federal medical jurisdiction. You are hereby restored to full active surgical authority, effective this second. Every resource, every operating room, and every staff member in that building is now under your direct command. If anyone attempts to obstruct you, my guards have orders to arrest them for treason." The line went dead with a soft click. The trauma bay was so quiet you could hear the rain hitting the glass 2 floors up. Captain Vance looked at me, gave a sharp, formal nod of his head, and stepped back. The armed Navy guards immediately turned toward Pendleton, their hands resting heavy on their tactical holsters. Their eyes locked onto the surgical director. Pendleton looked as if the earth had opened up beneath his feet. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow, his entire world crumbling into dust. I looked at Timmy, my voice calm and commanding. "Timmy, prep operating suite 3. We are moving in 60 seconds. "Yes, Commander," Timmy shouted, his eyes shining with pure adrenaline as he turned to mobilize the nursing staff. Then, I turned my eyes onto Dr. Arthur Pendleton. "Dr. Pendleton," I said softly, the words cutting through the air like a razor. "You are relieved of your duties. Get out of my bay." The doors of Trauma Bay 1 swung wide as 2 armed Navy guards escorted Dr. Arthur Pendleton out into the hallway. His face was a mask of pale humiliation, his eyes darting between the armed personnel and the floor, completely unable to meet the gazes of the nurses and orderlies who stood frozen in the corridor. For 3 years, his word had been law in this hospital. Now, he was being moved out of the way like common debris. "Keep the corridors completely clear," Captain Vance barked, his voice echoing through the tile hallway with absolute military weight. "Clear a direct path to the surgical elevators now." "Moving! We're moving!" Timmy shouted, guiding the head of the heavy transport gurney. I walked alongside the bed, bent slightly over the general's body, my left hand remaining firmly buried inside his chest cavity. My fingers held the torn wall of the subclavian artery against the cold bone of his first rib with millimeter-perfect pressure. Every step the gurney took created a rhythmic, sickening sway, sending sharp shocks of force through my forearm, but my grip didn't slip by a fraction of an inch. In field medicine, under fire, or during transport through rough terrain, you learn to become an immovable anchor for your patient. Your body absorbs the impact so the wound doesn't. Nurse Sarah Jenkins ran alongside us, hanging fresh bags of O-negative blood on the transport pole and spiking a line for rapid infusion. Her eyes were wide with a mix of shock and intense focus. "Pressure is holding at 64/38, Commander," she reported, her voice steady despite her rapid breathing. "Pulse is 42, weak but rhythmic. Keep the blood coming," I ordered, my voice calm, flat, and rhythmic. "Timmy, as soon as we hit operating suite 3, I want a thoracotomy tray, vascular clamps, 5/0 Proline sutures, and 2 suction heads running on maximum. I don't want a single second wasted looking for gear." "Understood, Commander. Everything will be open before you reach the table," Timmy replied, sprinting ahead to hit the elevator call button. The doors to the primary surgical elevator opened with a heavy mechanical chime. We crammed the gurney, the IV poles, Captain Vance, 2 armed guards, and the core trauma team into the steel carriage. The doors slid shut, and the elevator surged upward toward the 3rd floor. Captain Vance stood right beside me, his uniform still damp with rain and stained with blood. He watched my face with a quiet, intense scrutiny. The tension in his jaw was palpable, but beneath the hard exterior of a veteran officer, I could see the raw, human panic of a man watching a hero die. "How much time does he have, Commander?" Captain Vance asked softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the elevator motor. "He's been in profound hemorrhagic shock for over 40 minutes, I answered, keeping my eyes fixed on the general's pale, gray face. His core temperature is dropping due to the cold rain and fluid loss. We have a narrow window. Once we release my digital pressure to place the vascular clamps, we will have less than 3 minutes to secure the arterial graft before his heart starves completely." Captain Vance gave a single, slow nod. "General Marcus Vance has survived 3 combat deployments, 2 helicopter crashes, and 15 years of Pentagon politics. Don't let him die in an underfunded civilian hospital." "He's not dying today, Captain," I said. The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor. The main surgical wing, usually quiet and sterile at this hour, was in complete chaos. Word of the Pentagon order had spread like wildfire. Surgical technicians, circulating nurses, and anesthesiologists were scurrying back and forth between supply rooms, pushing carts and prepping equipment. When they saw us emerge, a night shift general practitioner leading a team with her hand buried inside a 4-star general's chest, they froze, stepping back against the walls in stunned silence. we burst through the double doors of Operating Suite 3. The room was cold, illuminated by the massive circular LED surgical lamps overhead that cast a sterile, shadowless white glare over the stainless steel operating table. On my count, we transfer him, I commanded, positioning my body over the gurney. 1, 2, 3. In one synchronized fluid motion, we shifted General Vance from the transport gurney onto the operating table. The cardiac monitor was immediately hooked up, its harsh, rhythmic beeping filling the cold air of the suite. Beep, beep, beep. "Anesthesia is prepped," shouted Dr. Helen Miller, a veteran anesthesiologist who had rushed up from the staff lounge. She looked at me with deep respect, completely bypassing any questions about credentials or hierarchy. "Commander, his vitals are critical, but he's stable enough for induction. We are running rapid infusers on both central lines." "Induce him now, Helen," I said. "Keep him light. His pressure can't take heavy sedation." "Understood." "Tube is going in now." I stood at the left side of the table, my left hand still locked deep inside the wound, holding the bleeding at bay. Timmy was already at the scrub sink, frantically washing his hands, while Sarah draped sterile green towels around the general's exposed chest, leaving only the jagged, blood-soaked laceration exposed. Captain Vance took a position near the observation glass inside the room, his hand resting near his sidearm, watching every movement. "I need a gown and gloves," I said. A surgical tech rushed over, wrapping a sterile gown around my shoulders and pulling the sleeves down my arms while I kept my hand completely immobile inside the patient's chest. She held open a pair of size 7 sterile gloves, and I slid my right hand in, then carefully manipulated my left hand into the second glove without releasing the pressure on the subclavian artery for even a fraction of a second. "Thoracotomy tray is open, Commander," Timmy said, stepping up to the opposite side of the table, his hands gloved and ready. "Vascular clamps are staged. Suction is hot." "All right, team," I said, taking a slow, deep breath. The familiar, cold focus washed over me entirely, shutting out the world beyond the edges of the operating table. This is a complex subclavian artery laceration with probable retraction beneath the first rib. When I lift my fingers, the field is going to flood instantly. "Timmy, you keep 2 suction tips right on the edge of the bone. Do not let the field pool. Helen, watch the pressure. As soon as I clamp, expect a sudden spike in afterload." "Ready when you are, Commander," Helen said, her hands hovering over the anesthesia console. "Timmy, hand me the heavy bone cutters and a sternal retractor," I ordered. "Bone cutters?" Timmy repeated, his eyes wide behind his protective visor. "You're going to divide the clavicle? The vessel has retracted too far back," I explained calmly. "If I try to blindly reach beneath the bone without direct visualization, I'll tear the internal mammary artery or shred the brachial plexus. We need full exposure. We're dividing the middle third of the collarbone." Timmy handed me the heavy stainless steel instrument without another word. His previous nervousness was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, desperate focus of a doctor working under a master, releasing digital occlusion in 3, 2, 1. I slowly pulled my index and middle fingers out of the deep, bloody cavity. Instantly, the severed artery unleashed a violent, surging geyser of bright red arterial blood. The blood struck the overhead surgical light, spraying a fine mist across the sterile drapes. The cardiac monitor went wild, its beeping accelerating into a high-pitched, terrifying whine. "Pressure dropping! 50/20, 40/15, Helen yelled from the head of the bed. "He's crashing! Suction! Both heads, right now!" I commanded. Timmy plunged both suction tips deep into the wound. The mechanical whine of the pumps roared as they drew out thick streams of crimson, but the blood was filling the chest cavity faster than the machines could clear it. I didn't hesitate. I slid the jaw of the bone cutter over the center of the general's left clavicle bone. I applied heavy, calculated pressure with both hands. Crack. The sound of the bone snapping cleanly echoed through the operating suite like a gunshot. "Sternal retractor," I demanded. I placed the blades of the retractor between the severed ends of the clavicle and cranked the handle. The bone swung open like a door, exposing the deep, dark anatomy of the upper chest cavity. "There it is," Timmy gasped. Deep within the exposed field, surrounded by torn muscle and pool of dark blood, lay the severed end of the subclavian artery. It was pulsating violently, spraying blood with every weak beat of the general's failing heart. Vascular clamp, Satinsky type, I said, extending my right hand. The tech slapped the heavy, curved steel instrument into my palm. I guided the tips of the clamp into the bloody pool, relying on a combination of visual sighting and absolute muscle memory. I positioned the jaws around the pulsating vessel, just millimeters above its origin from the aortic arch. Click, click. I locked the ratchet mechanism of the clamp tight. The rushing geyser of blood stopped instantly. The operating field went completely still. The suction tips cleared the remaining pool in 3 seconds, revealing a dry, clean surgical field. Clamp is applied, I announced, my voice completely steady. Timmy, clear the field with sterile saline. Let's inspect the distal end. Pressure is stabilizing, Helen called out, a massive sigh of relief escaping her lips. 62/40. Heart rate is holding at 50. My God, Commander, that was incredible. We're not done yet, Helen, I said, taking a fine-tipped forceps to examine the damaged vessel. The tissue is severely contused from the shrapnel impact. A simple primary repair won't hold under normal physiological pressure. The tissue will just shred. Timmy leaned in, examining the ragged edges of the artery. So what do? We don't have a vascular graft prepped, and the blood bank at this hospital takes at least 40 minutes to thaw a synthetic conduit. We don't use a synthetic graft, I said. We perform an autologous saphenous vein harvest from his leg, or we transpose the internal mammary artery. Transpose the internal mammary? Timmy looked at me in sheer disbelief. That's an advanced cardiothoracic maneuver. I've only ever read about that in specialized military trauma journals. It's the fastest option we have, I said, reaching for a fine 10-blade scalpel. And we have about 12 minutes before the lack of distal blood flow causes permanent ischemic damage to his left arm. For the next 10 minutes, the operating suite existed in a state of absolute poetic precision. There was no shouting, no hesitation, no panic. I moved with a speed that defied standard surgical teaching, my hands executing complex vascular microsutures with the fluid, effortless grace of someone who had performed this exact procedure in blackout tents while artillery shook the earth. Timmy worked beside me, anticipating my every request, handing me instruments before I even named them. Sarah managed the bloodlines, ensuring a steady stream of warm, oxygenated blood flowed into the general's veins. Captain Vance stood by the glass, his eyes wide, watching a night shift doctor he had dismissed as a nobody perform a miracle on the vice chairman's commander. Final suture line complete, I said, tying off a delicate, microscopic knot on the arterial anastomosis. Preparing to release the vascular clamp and restore flow to the arm. Anesthesia ready, Helen confirmed. Volume is restored. Pressors on standby. I slowly unlatched the ratchet of the Satinsky clamp. The steel jaws opened. Blood rushed through the newly constructed arterial bridge, swelling the vessel into a healthy, pink pulsating tube. The repair held perfectly. Not a single drop of blood leaked from the suture line. Down at the general's left wrist, Timmy placed his gloved fingers over the radial artery site. His eyes suddenly lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. "I have a pulse," Timmy shouted, a massive grin breaking across his face. "Strong bounding radial pulse. The hand is turning pink. Cardiac rhythm is normalizing," Helen reported, her voice thick with emotion. 82 beats per minute sinus rhythm. Blood pressure is 110/70. He's stable, Commander. He's completely stable. A collective sigh of profound relief swept through the room. The circulating nurses wiped sweat from their foreheads, and Timmy collapsed slightly against the edge of the instrument table, letting out a breathless laugh. I stepped back from the operating table, stripping off my bloody outer gloves and tossing them into the biohazard bin. My hands, after nearly an hour of intense life-or-death exertion, were still perfectly steady. "Let's close the chest in layers, Timmy," I said, pointing to the open field. "Reapproximate the clavicle with a heavy wire plate, place a chest tube in the left pleural space, and close the fascia. You're leading the closure." Timmy looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise and immense gratitude. "Me? Commander, I've never closed a clavicular opening of this scale." "You're fully capable, Dr. Miller," I said, giving him a firm, reassuring nod. You kept your head when everything was falling apart down in the bay. You earned this." "Thank you, Commander," Timmy said, his voice choking up slightly as he took the needle driver. I walked toward the side door of the operating suite to scrub down. As I pushed through the swinging door into the scrub room, Captain Vance stepped out after me. He closed the door behind him, shutting out the rhythmic hum of the monitors and the quiet chatter of the surgical team. He stood before me in the small, brightly lit room. The silver eagle on his collar caught the fluorescent light. He looked at me for a long, silent moment, his face carrying a profound mixture of awe, guilt, and deep respect. Then, Captain Vance brought his feet together, squared his shoulders, and delivered a crisp, razor-sharp military salute. "Commander Vance," he said, his voice heavy with solemn authority, "on behalf of Naval Special Warfare, the United States Navy, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thank you. You just saved the life of a national treasure." I slowly raised my right hand to my brow, returning the salute with exact military precision. "I was just doing my job, Captain," I said softly. He lowered his hand, his expression softening slightly. "It wasn't just your job, Clara. What you did in there. No civilian surgeon in this state could have pulled that off. You operated with the skill of a ghost." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched my face. "When the vice chairman called from the Pentagon, he didn't just know your name. He knew exactly where you were. Clara, who are you really? Why is a Navy surgeon with your level of mastery hiding in the night shift of an underfunded VA hospital?" I looked at him, my face remaining a calm, unreadable mask. "That's a long story, Captain. One that involves a lot of classified files and people who would prefer I stay forgotten." Before Captain Vance could ask another question, the outer door to the scrub room slammed open. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stood in the doorway, her face pale, holding a wireless hospital phone in her hand. She looked between Captain Vance and me, her breathing frantic. "Commander Vance," Sarah said, her voice trembling violently. "It's the hospital main desk. Dr. Arthur Pendleton just called an emergency executive session of the hospital board in the main auditorium down on the first floor." I turned to look at her. "An emergency session? On what grounds?" "He's claiming that you commandeered an operating suite without proper administrative clearance, that you performed an experimental, unauthorized procedure on a high-ranking military officer, and that you threatened hospital staff with armed guards," Sarah explained, her voice rising in panic. "He's gathered the entire board of directors right now. He's demanding the immediate revocation of your medical license and your arrest by local police for medical impersonation." Captain Vance let out a harsh, cold laugh, his jaw tightening with fury. "That arrogant little bureaucrat just doesn't know when to stop, does he?" "He has his brother-in-law on that board, Captain," Sarah warned, her eyes filled with fear. "And 3 major corporate donors who fund this facility. They are preparing a formal order to lock down the hospital records and strip Clara's credentials before the media or the Navy can file official paperwork." I stood there in the quiet scrub room, listening to the rain beat against the glass outside. I pulled off my surgical cap, letting my dark hair fall back into its simple knot. For 3 years, I had run from this exact fight. I had accepted the lies, the buried records, and the quiet shadow of the night shift just to keep practicing medicine. I had let men like Arthur Pendleton rule these halls, destroying careers and endangering lives, all because I wanted to stay invisible. I looked at my hands, clean, steady, and capable of holding a dying man's heart in the dark. "Sarah," I said quietly, my voice dropping into a flat, dangerous frequency that made both her and Captain Vance freeze. "Call Dr. Miller. Tell him to finish the closure and transfer the general to the ICU under armed guard." "And what are you going to do, Clara?" Sarah asked, her breath catching in her throat. I walked over to the hook on the wall, grabbed my plain white lab coat and pulled it on over my navy scrubs. I didn't button it. I stood tall, my shoulders back, my posture returning to the rigid, unyielding stance of a commander who had survived mortar fire in Syria. I looked at Captain Vance and Nurse Jenkins, my eyes burning with a cold, unshakable fire. "I'm going down to that auditorium," I said. "It's time to end Arthur Pendleton." The doors of Operating Suite 3 slid closed behind me as I walked down the quiet third-floor hallway. Captain Vance marched half a step to my right, his dress shoes striking the polished floor with the crisp, heavy rhythm of a parade ground parade. Behind us, 2 armed Navy guards followed, their weapons slung low, tactical gear creaking softly with every stride. "My detail can clear that auditorium in 30 seconds, Commander," Captain Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried past the 2 of us. "We can take Pendleton and his board members into military custody right now under the executive directive." "No, Captain," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the elevator bank. "If you drag him out in handcuffs before he presents his case, he becomes a victim in the eyes of the hospital board. He'll hide behind corporate lawyers, file injunctions, and claim the military staged a coup over a civilian health facility. We don't just stop him. We let him lay his own trap, and then we spring it." Captain Vance glanced sideways at me, a faint, approving smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "You sound like a tactical officer preparing an ambush." "I spent 6 years working alongside special warfare units, Captain," I said, hitting the call button for the executive elevator. "You learn very quickly that the most dangerous weapon in a fight isn't a rifle. It's letting your opponent believe he's winning right up until the floor drops out beneath him." The elevator doors chimed and opened. We stepped inside, the steel walls reflecting our group. A Navy captain in damp, blood-stained blues, 2 armed guards, and a night shift doctor in plain scrubs with a white lab coat pulled over her shoulders. As the elevator descended toward the first floor, I reached into the pocket of my lab coat. My fingers brushed against my small, leather-bound personal notebook, the one where I kept detailed, time-stamped records of every surgical intervention, every patient assessment, and every piece of medical logic I had applied since joining St. Jude. Pendleton thought he was going to destroy me with manufactured policy violations and administrative jargon. He had no idea that while he was spending his years cutting budgets and threatening junior nurses, I was documenting the cold, hard reality of his incompetence. The doors opened onto the main administrative concourse of the first floor. Normally, at 6:40 in the morning, this area was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of floor buffers and the smell of fresh coffee from the cafeteria. Today, the air was thick with tension. Staff members from every department, nurses in blue scrubs, orderlies, medical students, and administrative assistants, were gathered in small, whispering huddles near the double-glass doors of the main hospital auditorium. When they saw us exit the elevator, the concourse went completely silent. Heads turned, whispers died down instantly. Everyone knew what was happening. Pendleton had summoned the board for an emergency tribunal, and the quiet night shift doctor who had saved a 4-star general was walking straight into the lion's den. I walked past them with my head held high, my posture erect, my stride steady and measured. I didn't look down. I didn't rush. I moved with the unhurried, terrifying confidence of a commander walking onto a battlefield she had already mapped. Nurse Sarah Jenkins was waiting outside the auditorium doors, her face pale, her hands clutching a folder filled with surgical logs. Beside her stood Dr. Timmy Miller, still wearing his surgical cap, his scrubs stained with iodine and drying blood from the chest closure. "Commander," Timmy said, stepping forward, his eyes bright with adrenaline. "General Vance is in the intensive care unit on the 4th floor. Chest tube is draining properly. His arterial line is reading 112/74, and his distal pulse in the left arm is full and bounding. The ICU team is monitoring him under heavy guard." "Good work, Timmy," I said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "How is he handling the recovery?" "He's completely stable, Dr. Vance. Dr. Miller, the anesthesiologist, says his core temp is back up to 37 degrees Celsius. He's sleeping under light sedation." Timmy swallowed hard, looking at the heavy wooden doors of the auditorium. "Pendleton has been in there for 10 minutes. He brought in his brother-in-law, Harold Finch, the chairman of the board, along with 4 other board members. They've locked the doors to the public, but we can hear him shouting through the wood." "What is he saying?" Captain Vance asked, stepping up beside us. "He's telling them that Dr. Vance illegally seized control of the trauma bay, that she used military personnel to intimidate civilian staff, and that she performed an unapproved, barbaric procedure that violated every protocol in the state," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Finch is already drafting a formal suspension order to hand over to the city police." Captain Vance took a step toward the heavy wooden doors, his jaw clenching. "Not while I'm breathing." "Hold position, Captain," I commanded softly. I looked at Sarah and Timmy. "Are the surgical logs from Operating Suite 3 printed and time-stamped?" "Right here," Sarah said, handing me a crisp 3-page document fresh from the printer. Every vital sign, every instrument count, every medication dose, and the exact timestamp of the arterial clamp placement. "Perfect," I said, tucking the pages into my lab coat pocket alongside my notebook. I looked at Captain Vance. "Captain, I want your guards to post at the doors. Nobody leaves this room once we walk in." "Understood, Commander," Captain Vance replied. He turned to his 2 armed guards and gave a sharp downward gesture with his hand. The guards immediately moved into position, taking up hard stances on either side of the heavy double doors, their hands resting near their sidearms. I took a deep, steadying breath. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anxiety. I felt the cold, crystalline clarity that comes right before an engagement. For 3 years, I had let men like Arthur Pendleton dictate the terms of my life. I had accepted the shadows because I thought hiding was the only way to keep doing what I was born to do. But standing outside those doors, listening to the faint, arrogant echo of Pendleton's voice inside, I realized the truth. You don't defeat a tyrant by hiding in the dark. You defeat him by stepping into the light and stripping away his lies piece by piece. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the auditorium and stepped inside. The room was vast. An amphitheater-style lecture hall with rows of empty blue velvet seats sloping down toward a central stage. At the bottom of the stage sat a long, polished oak table. Seated behind it were 5 people in expensive suits, the executive board of St. Jude VA Medical Center. At the center of the table sat Harold Finch, 62 years old, thin, with slicked-back gray hair, expensive gold-rimmed glasses, and a posture that radiated corporate arrogance. To his right sat Dr. Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton had cleaned himself up slightly, but he still looked disheveled. He had pulled on a fresh white lab coat over his rumpled shirt, but he hadn't managed to wash all the dried arterial blood from beneath his fingernails. He was standing near a podium, gesturing aggressively toward a projection screen that displayed a hastily assembled slide deck of hospital administrative policies. A complete collapse of institutional authority. Pendleton's voice boomed through the empty hall, echoing off the mahogany walls. She ignored direct orders from the surgical director. She physically barred me from the trauma bay using armed military escort, and she performed a high-risk, uncredentialed surgical intervention on a 4-star officer without administrative approval. If this board does not act immediately to strip her license and hand her over to law enforcement, this facility will face catastrophic liability from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Finch nodded heavily, his gold pen hovering over a stack of formal legal documents. "This is a nightmare, Arthur. A rogue general practitioner operating outside her scope on a high-ranking military official. The press will tear us apart." Finch looked up, his cold gray eyes scanning the empty rows of seats until they landed on me standing at the top of the main aisle. Finch's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. He slammed his hand onto the oak table. "Who authorized you to enter this executive session?" "Security? Remove this woman." Pendleton turned around, his face instantly twisting into a sneer of victory when he saw me standing there in my plain scrubs and lab coat. He stepped out from behind the podium, his chest puffed out, his confidence fully restored now that he was surrounded by his allies and his brother-in-law. "Look who decided to show up," Pendleton said, his voice dripping with condescension as it echoed through the auditorium. "Dr. Clara Vance, or should I say, the former night shift doctor who just destroyed her entire career in under 2 hours." I didn't answer him right away. I slowly walked down the carpeted aisle, my footsteps silent against the floor. Behind me, Captain Vance, Nurse Sarah, and Dr. Timmy Miller followed, taking up positions in the row of seats directly behind the executive table. I stopped 10 feet from the oak table, standing straight, my hands folded calmly in front of me. "Dr. Pendleton," I said, my voice low, clear, and perfectly modulated. "Harold Finch." "Members of the board." Finch stood up, leaning his hands on the table, glaring down at me. You have no standing to speak here, Dr. Vance. This is a closed executive hearing regarding your immediate termination and referral to the Texas State Medical Board for gross negligence and impersonation of a surgical specialist. On what charge, Mr. Finch? I asked softly. Pendleton stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. On the charge of practicing medicine without credentials. On the charge of violating every protocol this hospital stands for. You are a basic triage physician, Clara. You have no surgical privileges at St. Jude. You took a scalpel to a 4-star general's chest in an unsterile emergency bay, and then you hijacked Operating Suite 3. I saved the life of General Marcus Vance, I replied, my eyes locking onto Pendleton's. A life that was slipping away because you stood over his bleeding body in Trauma Bay 1 with your hands shaking so violently you dropped your instruments on the floor. Pendleton's face flushed a deep, mottled red. That is a slanderous lie, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. I was in the middle of executing a standard vascular stabilization protocol when you and your military co-conspirators physically threatened me and forced me out of the room. Is that the official story you're selling to the board, Arthur? Captain Vance's voice cut through the air like a broadsword as he stepped down the aisle, his navy blues immaculate, his 4-star brother's blood still visible on his sleeve. He stood beside me, glaring at Finch and Pendleton with cold, military fury. Because I was standing 18 inches from you in that bay. I watched you plunge a suction tip blindly into my brother's chest, tear the subclavian vessel further, and then drop your clamps because you were terrified. Finch blinked behind his glasses, visibly uncomfortable under the gaze of a Navy captain. Captain Vance, we understand this is an emotional situation for you, but Dr. Pendleton is the surgical director of this facility. He understands the administrative and clinical boundaries. Arthur Pendleton is a coward, Captain Vance interrupted, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying growl. He almost killed the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff because he was more worried about his administrative ego than stopping an arterial bleed. If Commander Clara Vance hadn't stepped in, my brother would be in a body bag right now. Finch cleared his throat nervously, looking at Pendleton, then back at the legal document in front of him. Be that as it may, Captain. Dr. Vance is employed here as a general practitioner. She does not hold surgical credentials at St. Jude. Under state law and hospital bylaws, an uncredentialed physician performing invasive cardiovascular surgery constitutes a severe violation, regardless of the outcome. Pendleton smirked, folding his arms over his chest. You see, Clara, it doesn't matter what happened in that room. You broke the law. You violated hospital policy. You have no record of surgical training, no board certifications in trauma surgery, and no authorization from me. You are finished. I looked at Pendleton for a long moment. Then, slowly, I reached into the pocket of my lab coat and pulled out the 3 printed pages of surgical logs Sarah had given me, along with my leather notebook. I stepped up to the oak table and laid the documents flat in front of Harold Finch. What is this? Finch asked, frowning at the pages. Those are the real-time surgical logs from Operating Suite 3, I said, my voice calm and commanding, including a complete second-by-second breakdown of the procedure performed on General Marcus Vance. You will find that I executed a median clavicular transection, a Satinsky clamp application on the proximal subclavian arch, and an autologous transposition of the internal mammary artery to bypass the torn segment. Finch stared at the technical terms on the page, completely out of his depth. He looked up at Pendleton. Arthur, why, what does this mean? Pendleton scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. It's technical jargon she copied out of a textbook. She's trying to obfuscate the fact that she had no right to be in that room. It's not jargon, Arthur. Dr. Timmy Miller spoke up from the second row, his voice shaking with anger as he stepped forward. I assisted her during the entire 90-minute operation. I watched her divide the clavicle with a bone cutter, locate a retracted vessel in a flooded field, and place microscopic vascular sutures in under 12 minutes. I've seen chief cardiovascular surgeons at Johns Hopkins take 3 hours to perform that same maneuver. Dr. Vance didn't just save that man's life. She performed surgery at a level this hospital hasn't seen in 20 years. Silence, Dr. Miller, Pendleton barked, turning to glare at the resident. You are a junior resident. Your career here hangs by a thread. Do not throw it away for an imposter. He's not throwing anything away, Dr. Pendleton, I said softly, stepping closer to Pendleton until I was standing less than 3 feet from him. Because you are no longer in a position to threaten anyone's career, Pendleton sneered, stepping into my space, trying to use his height to intimidate me, just like he had done in the break room and in Trauma Bay 4. And who is going to stop me, Clara? You, a disgraced, quiet little night shift GP who thinks she can play hero? You have no power here. This board answers to Harold Finch, and Harold Finch answers to me. By 8 o'clock this morning, your name will be wiped from our system, your license will be flagged, and you will be escorted off this property in handcuffs. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a vicious whisper that only I could hear. You should have stayed invisible, Clara. You should have stayed in the dark. I looked into his eyes filled with desperate arrogance, greed, and the small, pathetic fear of a man who knew his empire was built on sand. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into the breast pocket of my scrubs and pulled out a small, metallic object I had carried with me every single day for 3 years. It was wrapped in a soft piece of velvet cloth. I unrolled the cloth and placed the object squarely in the center of the oak table, right between Harold Finch's gold pen and Pendleton's official hospital badge. The heavy morning light catching through the auditorium's high windows struck the metal, making it gleam with a sharp, brilliant silver luster. It was a military insignia pin, an eagle clutching an anchor and a trident, superimposed over a crossed pair of surgical scalpels. The crest of a commander in the United States Navy Medical Corps, decorated with the combat action ribbon of Special Warfare Development Group. Harold Finch froze, his eyes widening in shock as he looked down at the heavy silver pin. He reached out a trembling finger, touching the polished edge of the insignia. What is this? Pendleton stared at the silver trident, his breath catching in his throat, the color instantly draining from his face until he looked as pale as the sheets in Bay 1. That's impossible. That is my official military commission, Mr. Finch, I said, my voice ringing through the vast, empty auditorium with the absolute, unyielding authority of a senior military officer. Commander Clara Vance, former Chief Trauma Surgeon, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. Decorated with the Bronze Star with valor for surgical interventions performed under enemy fire in Syria. The room went dead, terrifyingly silent. Finch slowly looked up from the silver pin, his eyes fixed on me in utter horror. A Navy Special Warfare Surgeon? For 3 years I let you people think I was just a quiet general practitioner. I continued, stepping up to the table, my eyes burning through Pendleton like a laser. I took your night shifts. I filled out your paperwork. I endured your threats, Arthur, because I wanted to practice medicine in peace. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could do good work in the shadows without dragging my past into this hospital. I paused, leaning forward over the table, my posture radiating the cold, lethal presence of a commander who had survived mortar strikes and corrupt superiors. But you mistook my silence for weakness, I said softly, every word landing like a hammer blow on Pendleton's chest. You thought you could intimidate my residents, endanger my patients, and use your pathetic administrative power to destroy good people. You wanted to know who authorized me to operate today, Arthur. The United States Department of Defense authorized me. The Executive Office authorized me. And the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized me. Pendleton took a slow, trembling step backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. Finch, do something. She's lying. She's making this up. Finch didn't answer him. He was staring at the silver pin, his hands shaking violently as the full, terrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon his head. He realized in an instant that he wasn't dealing with a defenseless employee he could fire quietly in an office. He was dealing with a decorated military hero, backed by the highest levels of the Pentagon. Before Finch could speak, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium slammed open with a loud metallic bang that echoed like thunder through the hall. Everyone in the room turned around. Standing in the doorway of the auditorium was Rear Admiral Thomas Crane, dressed in full Navy service dress blues, flanked by 3 military investigators carrying heavy leather briefcases and 2 federal marshals in dark suits. Admiral Crane swept his cold, steel-gray eyes over the empty seats until they locked onto Arthur Pendleton and Harold Finch. He didn't rush. He marched down the central aisle with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a battleship entering a harbor. "Harold Finch! Arthur Pendleton!" Admiral Crane's voice boomed through the auditorium, vibrating the mahogany walls. "This executive session is officially terminated by order of the United States Department of Justice and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service." Pendleton stumbled backward against the podium, his knees buckling slightly. Admiral Crane, there's been a massive misunderstanding. We were just conducting a routine administrative review." "Shut your mouth, Pendleton!" Admiral Crane roared, stopping right at the edge of the stage, glaring at the surgical director with absolute unbridled fury. "We have spent the last 6 hours reviewing the financial and administrative records of St. Jude VA Medical Center. We have documented 16 instances of illegal budget diversion, systemic falsification of patient safety records, and the intentional suppression of medical malpractice complaints filed by veterans." Finch's face went completely gray. "Admiral, I assure you the board was unaware of any financial irregularities. The board is currently under federal subpoena, Mr. Finch," Admiral Crane snapped, pointing at the federal marshals behind him. "Agents, secure all hospital servers, lock down the executive offices, and place Dr. Arthur Pendleton and Harold Finch under immediate federal custody pending indictment for defense procurement fraud and reckless endangerment of military personnel." The 2 federal marshals stepped up onto the stage, pulling pair of gleaming steel handcuffs from their belts. Pendleton looked around the auditorium in utter panicked disbelief. His eyes darted to Finch, who had collapsed into his leather chair, head in his hands. He looked at the armed guards, at the federal marshals, and finally, his gaze landed on me. I stood there by the oak table, my hands resting calmly at my sides, my white lab coat open over my scrubs, the silver navy trident gleaming between us on the polished wood. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched him with the calm, steady eyes of a commander who had watched the truth finally catch up to a tyrant. As the federal marshals grabbed Pendleton's arms and pulled his hands behind his back, clicking the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists, he looked at me one last time. The arrogant, untouchable surgical director of St. Jude was gone. In his place stood a small, broken man trembling in a blood-stained shirt. Who are you?" Pendleton whimpered, his voice barely a whisper as he was forced toward the aisle. I picked up my silver navy trident from the table, rolled it carefully back into its soft piece of velvet, and slipped it into my pocket. I looked Arthur Pendleton dead in the eye. "I'm the doctor you banned from the OR," I said quietly, "and you're finished in my hospital." The heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium slammed shut as federal marshals escorted Arthur Pendleton and Harold Finch down the concourse in handcuffs. The click of their boots against the polished tile faded into the distance, leaving the vast lecture hall in a heavy, ringing silence. Harold Finch's leather folder lay open on the oak table, its paper corners fluttering slightly in the draft from the hallway. Beside it sat my printed surgical logs and the velvet cloth where my silver navy pin had rested moments before. Rear Admiral Thomas Crane stood at the foot of the stage, his hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes tracking the empty aisle where Pendleton had just been dragged away. Behind him, the 2 federal investigators were already boxing up Finch's documents, sliding flash drives into evidence bags with quiet, practiced efficiency. Captain Vance exhaled a long, heavy breath, resting his hands on the back of a blue velvet seat. He looked at me, a faint, weary smile touching his face. "I've seen a lot of tactical maneuvers in my 30 years, Commander. But watching you hand that bureaucrat his own head on a silver platter, that was something else." "It wasn't a maneuver, Captain," I said, smoothing down the front of my white lab coat. It was just the truth finally catching up to him. Admiral Crane turned around, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he approached the table. He was 61 years old, with sharp, aristocratic features, and the kind of posture that made broad-shouldered captains look slouchy. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before extending his hand across the table. "Commander Vance," Crane said, his voice deep and raspy. "It's been a long time." I took his hand, giving it a firm, professional squeeze. Admiral Crane, I didn't expect to see you in San Antonio today. When the vice chairman gets a call that his brother is bleeding out in a civilian bay, people move fast, Crane said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied my face. And when I saw your name on the emergency transmission, I decided to take the flight from Washington myself. We have a lot to talk about, Clara. The general comes first, Admiral, I replied calmly. I need to check his post-operative status in the ICU. Of course, Crane nodded, stepping aside. Captain Vance and I will join you. We walked out of the auditorium together. The administrative concourse, which had been packed with whispering staff members an hour ago, was now lined with federal agents and military police securing the executive offices. Word had already reached the floors. Arthur Pendleton was gone, the board was suspended, and the quiet night shift doctor who had taken every unwanted shift for 3 years was actually a decorated Navy commander. As we reached the glass elevators to head up to the 4th floor intensive care unit, Nurse Sarah Jenkins and Dr. Timmy Miller fell into step beside us. Timmy was still clutching a clipboard, his face flushed with excitement, while Sarah carried a fresh stack of patient charts. Commander, Timmy said, his voice tight with enthusiasm. ICU bed 4 is fully prepped. General Vance's blood gas numbers just came back from the lab. pH is 7.38, lactate is down to 1.2, and his hematocrit has stabilized at 36%. His body is rewarming nicely. Excellent work, Timmy, I said as the elevator doors closed. Any signs of rebleeding from the chest tube? 0, Timmy reported proudly. Serosanguinous drainage only. Less than 50 cc's in the last hour. The vascular bridge you built is holding like iron. Good. Keep him on the low-dose fentanyl drip. We want him comfortable, but we need to assess his neurological status as soon as the sedation wears off. The elevator chimed and opened onto the 4th floor. The intensive care unit was quiet, sterile, and bathed in the soft, blue-tinted light of digital monitors. Armed Navy guards stood at the entrance to Bay 4, their faces rigid, but when they saw Captain Vance and me approaching, they immediately snapped to attention and stepped aside. Inside Bay 4, General Marcus Vance lay on the high-tech ICU bed. The heavy transport blankets had been replaced by a clean white duvet. His face, which had been as gray as ashes 2 hours ago in Trauma Bay 1, had regained a faint, healthy color. The rhythmic, reassuring beep of his cardiac monitor filled the room. Beep, 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 a steady 74 beats per minute. I stepped up to the left side of the bed, reaching out to feel his left wrist. The radial pulse beneath my fingers was strong, warm, and perfectly synchronized with the monitor. His peripheral perfusion is fully restored, I said softly, looking up at Captain Vance. His brain and organs suffered no ischemic damage during the transport. Captain Vance stood at the foot of the bed, staring at his older brother with raw relief in his eyes. He reached out, resting a hand on the general's booted foot beneath the blanket. He looks better than he did when we pulled him out of that transport wreckage. He's a fighter, Captain, Sarah murmured from the doorway, checking the IV pumps. And he had the best surgeon in the country holding his chest together. Admiral Crane walked to the window of the bay, looking out at the rain-streaked sky over San Antonio. The medical miracle is complete, Commander. Now we have to deal with the political fallout. Pendleton's arrest is going to trigger a massive investigation by the Inspector General. This entire facility is going to be restructured. Good, I said, adjusting the drip rate on the primary line. It's long overdue. The veterans who come through those front doors deserve doctors who care about their lives, not administrators counting line items on a spreadsheet. And what about you, Clara? Crane asked, turning around to face me, his hands resting on his belt. You can't go back to hiding in the night shift now. Your name is already on a dozen high-level transmissions between here and the Pentagon. The vice chairman wants a full debriefing. I looked down at General Vance's quiet face, my mind racing. For 3 years, the obscurity of St. Jude had been my shield. It was the place where I could put on plain scrubs, help people who needed it, and sleep without worrying about court-martials, sealed files, or political games. Now, that shield was completely shattered. Before I could answer, a soft, raspy cough came from the bed. Everyone in the room froze. General Marcus Vance shifted slightly beneath the duvet. His chest rose and fell in a deep, shuddering intake of breath. His eyelids flickered, heavy with remaining sedation, before slowly opening. His pale blue eyes were unfocused at first, tracking the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, before drifting toward the right side of the bed, where Captain Vance rushed forward. "Marcus," Captain Vance said, his voice cracking with emotion as he leaned over his brother. "Take it easy. You're at St. Jude VA in San Antonio. You're safe." The general's lips were dry and cracked. He tried to speak, but only a faint wheezing sound escaped his throat. "Don't try to talk yet, General," I said gently, stepping closer and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been through major vascular surgery. You have an endotracheal tube scar and a chest drain in place." General Marcus Vance slowly turned his head toward my voice. His pale blue eyes focused on my face. He looked at my dark hair, my plain scrubs, and the white lab coat resting on my shoulders. For a long, tense moment, the room was completely silent except for the steady hum of the ventilator. Then, a flicker of deep, undeniable recognition passed through the general's tired eyes. His hand, weak and trembling, lifted an inch off the bedsheet. His fingers reached out, blindly grasping until they found the sleeve of my lab coat. He squeezed my arm with surprising strength, for a man who had been dead on a table 2 hours ago. "Commander," General Vance rasped, his voice barely a whisper, but every single person in the room heard it with absolute clarity. "Commander." "Vance." Captain Vance blinked in surprise, looking between his brother and me. "Marcus, you know her?" The general swallowed hard, his throat working against the dry air. He didn't take his eyes off my face. A faint, bitter memory seemed to surface behind those blue eyes. A memory of dust, blood, and screaming engines. Joint Special Operations. 2023. General Vance whispered, his breath hitching slightly in his chest. "Syria. The bunker at Latakia." Admiral Crane stepped forward, his face suddenly tightening with intense interest. "Latakia? They told me. You were dead, Clara," General Vance continued, his voice growing slightly stronger as the adrenaline flared through his system. "The review board. They said you were court-martialed, stripped of your rank, discharged for desertion." I felt a cold tightness in my throat, but my face remained steady. "I wasn't dead, General. I was just reassigned to the shadows." "Lies?" General Vance spat out the word with surprising venom, his fingers tightening on my sleeve until his knuckles turned white. "All of it. Lies. I saw the intelligence reports after the extraction. I saw what you did in that bunker. You saved 4 of my finest operators, while the task force commander tried to leave them behind to cover his own tactical failure." Timmy and Sarah stared at the general, their mouths slightly open, listening to a 4-star general rewrite the history of the woman they had worked alongside for years. "I tried to find your file 6 months ago, Commander," General Vance rasped, his eyes burning with a fierce, ancient anger. "The files were sealed at the highest level by the Secretary's office. They buried you, because if the public knew you refused a retreat order to save 4 wounded soldiers, it would have exposed the entire command structure as cowards." The room was so quiet you could hear the rain tapping against the window pane. Captain Vance looked at me, his face pale with a mixture of horror and profound respect. "Is this true, Clara? They buried your career to cover up a command failure in Syria?" "It doesn't matter anymore, Captain," I said softly, gently pressing my hand over the general's fingers to ease his grip on my sleeve. "That was 3 years ago. My focus right now is keeping your brother alive." "It does matter," General Vance insisted, his chest heaving as he tried to sit up slightly, forcing Timmy to quickly adjust his pillows. "It matters because a commander who stays behind under fire doesn't get buried in a night shift while corrupt bureaucrats run hospitals." He looked up at Admiral Crane, his voice taking on the sharp, unyielding tone of a high commander issuing an order from a bunker. "Crane," General Vance demanded, coughing slightly, "get the vice chairman on the line. Tell him General Marcus Vance is alive. And tell him I am ordering an immediate, full-scale review of Commander Clara Vance's military record." Admiral Crane stood at attention, his face serious and resolute. "Consider it done, General." General Vance looked back at me. His grip on my sleeve finally loosened, his hand falling back onto the clean white duvet. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, the effort of speaking draining the last of his immediate reserves, but his expression was filled with absolute, unshakable certainty. "You saved my men in Syria, Clara," General Vance whispered, his eyelids beginning to flutter shut as the pain medication pulled him back toward rest. "And today, you saved me. The Navy owes you a debt, and I'm going to make sure they pay it." His breathing slowed down into a deep, rhythmic sleep. The cardiac monitor continued its steady, peaceful song. Beep, beep, beep. I stood by the bed for a long moment, looking down at the powerful man who had just blown my carefully constructed secret wide open in front of my staff, my colleagues, and the Pentagon. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wet with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara, you're a hero." "No, Sarah," I said, reaching down to pull the white duvet neatly over General Vance's shoulders. "I'm just a doctor who doesn't leave people behind." I turned around and walked out of Bay 4, stepping into the quiet, brightly lit corridor of the ICU. Captain Vance, Admiral Crane, Timmy, and Sarah followed me out into the hallway. The storm outside had finally begun to break, the heavy rain turning into a soft, misting drizzle as the first faint rays of dawn began to paint the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold. I stood by the large glass window at the end of the corridor, watching the morning light reflect off the wet helipad 4 floors below. The 3 Black Hawk helicopters were still parked there, their dark frames silhouetted against the rising sun, surrounded by armed guards who were now standing at ease. Captain Vance walked up beside me, leaning his shoulder against the window frame. He looked out at the morning, then turned to look at me. "So," Captain Vance said softly, "the secret is out." "What happens now, Commander?" I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool air from the window against my skin. For 3 years, I had carried the weight of a ruined career, a manufactured lie, and the quiet isolation of the dark. I had thought I was safe in the shadows. But standing there in the morning light, surrounded by people who finally knew the truth, I realized something fundamental. The shadows hadn't protected me. They had only kept me from fighting the battles that truly mattered. "Now, Captain," I said, my voice calm, clear, and steady as steel. "We finish what we started." The morning light was expanding across the horizon, turning the rain-slicked glass of the 4th floor corridor into a sheet of pale gold. Down on the helipad, the rotors of the Blackhawks had finally come to a complete stop, their heavy gray blades dripping condensation onto the wet tarmac. General Marcus Vance was resting quietly inside Bay 4, his vital signs steady, his radial pulse strong and rhythmic under the watchful eyes of the ICU staff. But outside the glass, in the wide corridor of the St. Jude VA Medical Center, the true aftermath of the morning was only beginning to unfold. I turned away from the window and smoothed down my scrubs. Captain Vance remained beside me, his jaw set in a hard, reflective line. Admiral Crane was standing a few feet away, speaking in hushed, sharp sentences into a secure satellite phone, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his belt. "The Vice Chairman is already convening an emergency session with Defense Legal," Admiral Crane said, lowering the device and looking directly at me. The moment General Vance mentioned Latakia, the entire diplomatic shield around that 2023 operation began to crack. "But you need to understand something, Clara. Arthur Pendleton might be in handcuffs right now, but he isn't going down without trying to drag you into the mud with him. Pendleton is facing federal fraud charges, Admiral," I said quietly. "What else could he possibly pull? A desperate man with corporate connections always has a final card to play," Crane replied grimly. "His legal defense team is already filing motions in the district court. They're claiming that every document, every surgical log, and every piece of testimony gathered against him this morning is poisoned fruit because it was collected under unlawful military coercion, led by an uncredentialed doctor." Before I could answer, the elevator doors at the end of the hall chimed and opened. Nurse Sarah Jenkins stepped out, holding a thick, dark blue leather folder against her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the armed guards stationed along the wall. Behind her walked James Nakamura, a 51-year-old surgical nurse with 23 years of Navy service under his belt, his gray-flecked hair cut in a tight, military fade. James was one of the few people at St. Jude who had known small fragments of my past. though he had never asked for details. He was a man of few words, quiet, methodical, and fiercely loyal to the patients. "Clara," Sarah said softly, her voice strained as she approached us. "James found something in the administrative basement. Something Pendleton tried to shred right after the code black was called." James stepped forward, placing a thick stack of printed, watermarked paper into my hands. "It wasn't in the standard digital server, Commander," James said, his voice carrying the calm, gravelly tone of an old deck sailor. "Pendleton kept a local, air-gapped drive in his private office safe. He was preparing a complete retrospective audit of your entire tenure here." I flipped through the pages. The documents were dated over the past 6 months. Pendleton hadn't just been watching me in the hallways. He had been systematically cross-referencing my shift schedules with every equipment order, every pharmacy requisition, and every minor clinical discrepancy across the entire hospital. "Look at page 12, James pointed out, his rough finger resting on a highlighted section. "He wasn't just planning to fire you for unauthorized surgery. He was fabricating a paper trail to accuse you of stealing controlled narcotics from the overnight surgical prep rooms. He had predated 3 false incident reports with forged signatures from junior nurses who left the hospital last year." Captain Vance leaned over my shoulder, reading the forged documents. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles popped. "This bastard was setting you up for a federal drug charge. If he had filed this before the general arrived, you would have been facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary." "He knew who you were, Clara," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. "Or at least, he knew you were hiding something huge. He wanted a weapon so absolute that if you ever tried to expose his budget cuts, he could destroy your credibility before you opened your mouth." It's classic institutional sabotage," I said, my voice entirely flat, devoid of anger. I had seen it before in Syria, and I was looking at it again in San Antonio. "Create a lie so loud and so damaging that the truth sounds like a desperate defense. This changes our legal standing," Admiral Crane said, taking the blue folder from my hands and examining the forged signatures. "This isn't just administrative retaliation. This is criminal conspiracy and evidence tampering. With this paper trail, Pendleton's defense team won't be able to claim military overreach. They'll be fighting to keep him out of a maximum security prison. We need to secure the original hard drive," I said, looking at James. "Where is the physical server unit?" "Locked in the 3rd floor administrative vault," James replied. "Federal marshals have the perimeter, but the hospital's legal counsel, Richard Vance, no relation to the captain, just arrived on the 1st floor. He's trying to assert corporate privilege to seal the vault before the NCIS team can mirror the drives." Captain Vance let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Corporate privilege? Over a federal military investigation involving a 4-star officer? Not on my watch. We go down together," I said, pulling my white coat tight over my scrubs. "James, bring the physical printouts. Sarah, stay here with Timmy and monitor the general's pressure. If there's even a single millimeter shift in his chest tube drainage, page me immediately." "Understood, Commander," Sarah nodded firmly, turning back toward Bay 4. We moved down the quiet corridors toward the central elevator bank. As we descended toward the 3rd floor, the air felt heavy, charged with the quiet intensity of an impending clash. St. Jude was no longer just an underfunded hospital. It had become a battlefield where 3 years of buried corruption, military secrets, and corporate greed were colliding head-on. The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor administrative wing. The wide concourse was sealed with yellow tape, guarded by 2 armed federal marshals in dark suits. But standing right outside the heavy steel door of the administrative vault was a tall, sharp-looking man in a 3-piece charcoal suit, holding a leather briefcase like a shield. Richard Vance, St. Jude's chief legal counsel, was 48 years old, with slicked-back dark hair, immaculate grooming, and an aura of supreme litigious confidence. Beside him stood 2 private security guards hired by the hospital's parent corporation. "I am telling you, Agent," Richard Vance's voice echoed sharply through the hallway as he confronted the federal marshals. "Under state corporate law, the physical servers inside this vault contain proprietary financial data and privileged physician-patient communications. You cannot execute a blanket seizure without a specific warrant signed by a state magistrate. The seizure is authorized under Title 10 of the United States Code, Mr. Vance, one of the marshals replied calmly, keeping his hand resting near his sidearm. National security override. National security does not give the Navy carte blanche to raid a private healthcare facility. Richard Vance snapped, stepping closer to the vault door. I am filing an emergency injunction in federal district court right now. Until a judge rules, no one touches those drives. Is that so, Mr. Vance? I said, stepping out of the elevator bank and walking down the corridor toward him. Richard Vance turned his head sharply. He looked at me, a woman in plain navy scrubs and a white lab coat. Then his eyes drifted to Captain Vance in his blood-stained blues and Admiral Crane in his 4-star decorated uniform. For a fraction of a second, his confident, legalistic mask flickered with uncertainty. Dr. Clara Vance, Richard Vance said, adjusting his silk tie, his voice instantly taking on a cold, patronizing tone. I suggest you step back. You are currently the central subject of a massive corporate internal investigation. Your presence in this wing is a direct violation of hospital administrative policy. I don't answer to hospital administrative policy anymore, Richard, I said, stopping 5 feet from him, my hands folded calmly behind my back. And neither does Arthur Pendleton. Richard Vance sneered slightly, taking a step toward me. Arthur Pendleton may have been detained, but this facility is owned by a private healthcare conglomerate. We hold the operational license. You are an uncredentialed general practitioner who hijacked an operating suite, manipulated military personnel, and violated federal privacy laws by accessing executive files. He held up his leather briefcase, his expression hardening into a cold, predatory smile. I have already drafted the formal complaint to the Texas State Board. By noon today, your temporary medical license will be revoked. Your name will be entered into the National Practitioner Data Bank as a clinical hazard, and you will be facing civil damages in excess of $5 million. Captain Vance took a step forward, his chest expanding with rage. You arrogant little pencil pusher! Do you have any idea who you're talking to? She just saved General Marcus Vance's life. The outcome of an unauthorized surgical procedure is legally irrelevant, Captain. Richard Vance snapped back, his voice rising in the empty concourse. A doctor without credentials operating in an unapproved facility is committing a felony. The law does not care about your military rank, and it certainly does not care about Dr. Vance's sentimentality. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose my temper. I looked at Richard Vance with the calm, terrifying precision of a surgeon identifying a tumor. You're right, Richard, I said softly, every word echoing clearly off the marble floor. The law doesn't care about sentimentality. It cares about evidence. I gestured to James Nakamura, who stepped forward and handed the thick blue folder directly to Richard Vance. The lawyer looked down at the folder in confusion, hesitating before opening the leather cover. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes scanning the time-stamped logs, the forged narcotics requisitions, and the predated incident reports bearing Arthur Pendleton's private digital signature. As he read, the supreme litigious confidence on Richard Vance's face began to melt away. His eyes darted frantically across the lines. The color slowly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sallow and gray under the harsh fluorescent lights. Where did you get this? Richard Vance stammered, his voice suddenly losing its sharp edge. That came directly from Arthur Pendleton's private, air-gapped drive, I said, stepping closer to him, my voice dropping into a low, deadly frequency. The drive he kept in the vault right behind you. The drive you are currently trying to shield from federal investigators. Richard Vance swallowed hard, his throat working against his tight collar. This is an internal administrative draft. It has no legal standing. It's not an administrative draft, Richard, Admiral Crane interrupted, stepping up beside me, his 4-star presence towering over the lawyer. That is physical evidence of a criminal conspiracy to fabricate federal drug charges against a decorated Navy officer. And under Section 101 of Title 18, anyone who knowingly assists in the concealment or destruction of that evidence becomes a co-conspirator to federal obstruction of justice. Admiral Crane leaned in close to the lawyer, his voice cold as ice. If you stand in front of that door for another 10 seconds, Mr. Vance, I will have these marshals place you in handcuffs right beside Arthur Pendleton, and I guarantee you, Corporate privilege will not save you from a 10-year stretch in a federal penitentiary. Richard Vance stood frozen in the hallway. He looked at the blue folder in his trembling hands, then at the two federal marshals who stepped forward, their heavy leather handcuffs gleaming under the lights. He looked at Captain Vance, at Admiral Crane, and finally at me, standing there in my plain scrubs, completely unbothered by his threats, holding all the cards. The lawyer's knees seemed to give way slightly. He slowly lowered his leather briefcase to his side. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Without saying another word, Richard Vance stepped away from the steel door of the administrative vault, his head bowed, his silk tie crooked, completely defeated. "Clear the door," the federal marshal commanded. The two private corporate guards quickly stepped back, holding their hands open, completely unwilling to risk their own freedom for a falling hospital administration. The marshal pulled a heavy digital keycard from his pocket, swiped it through the vault scanner, and punched in the federal override code. The heavy steel door of the vault unlocked with a deep pneumatic hiss, swinging open to reveal the rows of black server racks humming softly inside the dark, climate-controlled room. "NCIS tech team, move in," Admiral Crane ordered into his radio. "Mirror every drive. I want every email, every budget ledger, and every deleted file from the last 3 years extracted in 30 minutes. 3 naval intelligence technicians carrying black diagnostic cases rushed past us into the vault, their fingers already flying across portable keyboards as they hooked into the primary servers. I stood in the hallway, watching the green lights of the servers flicker in the dark room. James Nakamura walked up beside me, leaning against the wall, a quiet look of satisfaction on his weathered face. "That felt pretty good, Commander." James muttered quietly. "Better than a successful audit." "It's just the beginning, James," I said, looking down the long, empty concourse. "Pendleton and Finch were just the symptoms. The real damage is what they did to this hospital over 3 years." Before James could reply, the wireless phone in my pocket began to vibrate aggressively. I pulled it out and clicked the line open. "Dr. Vance." "Clara, come to the ICU right now." Nurse Sarah Jenkins's voice screamed through the speaker, frantic, raw with terror, drowned out by the chaotic blare of high-decibel alarms ringing in the background. "It's General Vance. His pressure just collapsed. 90/40, 80/30. He's going into violent ventricular fibrillation." My heart slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer. "Did the arterial repair fail? Is he bleeding from the chest tube?" "No, the tube is dry," Sarah yelled over the deafening alarms. "It's not the artery. His heart is seizing. Dr. Miller is preparing the defibrillator pads right now, but his rhythm is completely chaotic. Clara, he's dying." I didn't wait to hear another word. "Timmy, get the crash cart ready," I shouted into the phone, turning on my heel and sprinting down the hallway toward the elevator bank at top speed, my lab coat billowing behind me like a sail. "I'm on my way!" Captain Vance and Admiral Crane were right on my heels, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. "What happened?" Captain Vance yelled as we crammed into the elevator, his face pale as death. "You said the vascular bridge was holding." "The vascular bridge is holding," I said, my mind racing through every anatomical possibility at lightning speed, calculating the deadly variables. The bleeding was stopped, but the general suffered severe myocardial ischemia during the 40 minutes he was in shock. His heart muscle was starved of oxygen for too long. A massive clot or a delayed reperfusion injury is triggering a fatal arrhythmia. The elevator doors slammed open on the 4th floor. The intensive care unit was in absolute chaotic turmoil. Alarms were screaming from every bay, a high-pitched, continuous wall of sound that vibrated the glass walls. ICU nurses were running back and forth with crash carts, medication trays, and oxygen tanks. We burst through the doors of Bay 4. Inside, the scene was horrific. General Marcus Vance was violently convulsing on the ICU bed, his back arching off the mattress, his face contorted in agony. The primary monitor display was a terrifying, chaotic squiggly line. Full-blown, coarse ventricular fibrillation. Beep, 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 beep. "V-fib confirmed," Dr. Timmy Miller shouted, holding 2 heavy defibrillator paddles over the general's exposed chest, his hands shaking. "Charging to 200 joules. Clear the bed." "Wait," I roared, stepping up to the left side of the bed and slamming my hand over Timmy's wrist, stopping the paddles an inch from the general's skin. Timmy looked at me in utter shock. "Dr. Vance, he's in V-fib. Protocol says shock immediately. If you shock him right now with a fresh, unhealed subclavian vascular repair and a sternal wire plate, the violent muscular contraction will tear the suture line clean off the aortic arch," I yelled over the screaming alarms, my eyes scanning the general's neck and chest in 3 seconds flat. "You'll rupture the repair from the inside out. He will exsanguinate into his own chest cavity before the pads even finish discharging." Captain Vance grabbed the edge of the bed, his voice choked with absolute horror. "Then what do we do? His heart is dying." I looked at the chaotic squiggly line on the monitor, then at the general's darkening face, my mind locking into a state of cold, terrifying, absolute focus. There was no time for imaging. There was no time to run to an operating suite. There was no time for textbook medicine. "Timmy," I commanded, my voice dropping into a flat, deadly calm that froze everyone in the room. "Hand me a 10-blade scalpel and a set of sterile rib spreaders from the emergency tray." Timmy's eyes went wider than I had ever seen them. A scalpel? In the ICU bay? "We are reopening his chest right now," I said, reaching out my hand. "I am going to perform internal cardiac massage and manually clear the coronary occlusion with my fingers." Captain Vance choked on his breath. Admiral Crane stepped forward, his face pale. "Clara, open chest cardiac massage in an unsterile ICU room? If you do this, if he contracts an infection or dies under your hands..." I turned my head and looked Admiral Crane dead in the eye, my gaze burning with an unyielding, unshakable fire. "If I don't do this, Admiral," I said softly, "he dies in 60 seconds. I extended my hand toward Timmy, my fingers steady as stone. "Scalpel. Now." The cold steel of the 10-blade scalpel was in my right hand before Timmy even fully processed my order. The ICU bay was an orchestra of absolute panic. The primary cardiac monitor was screaming in a single, unbroken, high-decibel pitch as the chaotic zigzag of ventricular fibrillation flattened into a terrifying, erratic tremor. General Marcus Vance's body had stopped convulsing. His muscles went limp, his jaw dropped open, and his face turned from a mottled purple to the hollow, ash-gray hue of clinical death. "Pour iodine straight over the dressing," I barked at Nurse Sarah Jenkins, my voice cutting through the blare of the alarms like a blade. "Don't bother with a full prep, just dump it." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed a giant brown bottle of povidone iodine, unscrewed the cap, and poured the cool liquid directly over the general's freshly bandaged left chest. The brown fluid splashed over his skin, soaking the sterile drapes and running down the sides of the bed onto the floor. "Timmy, grab the wire cutters and hold the suction," I commanded, positioning the tip of the scalpel right along the fresh surgical incision we had closed less than 2 hours ago. "Helen, push 1 milligram of epinephrine and 200 milligrams of amiodarone straight through the central line. Give me continuous positive pressure ventilation. Epi and amiodarone going in now," Dr. Helen Miller shouted from the head of the bed, her hands moving across the IV ports with frantic speed. I sliced clean through the skin sutures in a single sweeping motion. The fresh incision split open. I reached into the wound with my gloved fingers, feeling for the heavy stainless steel wire plate we had used to bind the 2 halves of his severed clavicle. "Wire cutters," I demanded, extending my left hand. Timmy slapped the heavy tool into my palm. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was slow, deep, and rhythmically paced. I reached deep into the surgical field, located the steel retaining wire, and clipped it with 2 quick metallic snaps. Clink, clink. I pulled the wire free, tossed it onto the floor, and inserted the blades of the retractor straight between the bone ends. I cranked the handle with my right wrist. The chest opened back up with a wet, heavy slide of tissue. The general's heart lay exposed in the open cavity beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU. It wasn't beating. It was squirming, a helpless, useless bag of dying muscle quivering like a bowl of jelly as electrical chaos tore through its chambers. "Suction the field," I ordered Timmy. He plunged the tip into the chest, clearing the small pool of accumulated serum in seconds. I slid my gloved right hand completely inside the general's chest, cupping his heart directly in my palm. The muscle was soft, cool, and trembling weakly against my skin. My thumb rested over the anterior descending artery, while my 4 fingers supported the massive left ventricle from behind. I began manual cardiac compression. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. I compressed his heart with precise, rhythmic pressure, manually pumping blood out of his ventricles, up through his aorta, and into his brain. "Look at the arterial line," Timmy gasped, his eyes wide as he stared at the digital monitor. With every manual squeeze of my fingers, the flatlined blood pressure jumped artificially on the screen. 70/40, 80/45, 85/50. "You're perfusing his brain!" Captain Vance yelled from the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the metal railing so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "My God, Clara, you're pumping his blood by hand. Keep those compressions steady, Clara," Helen called out, watching the oxygen saturation monitor climb from 40% back up to 82%. "You're keeping him alive. It's a massive coronary spasm complicated by an acute microthrombus," I said, my voice completely steady despite the physical exertion of manually pumping a human heart. The shock from the subclavian tear starved his right coronary artery. "Helen, give me 10 milligrams of intracardiac verapamil and a direct warm saline flush." Sarah rushed over with a long, thin spinal needle loaded with the clear medication. "Ready, Commander." "Inject directly into the myocardium, right above my thumb," I instructed. Sarah drove the needle through the open chest cavity, plunging the medication straight into the quivering heart muscle. I kept up the manual rhythm. Squeeze, release. Squeeze, release. For 90 agonizing seconds, the only sounds in the room were the rhythmic huffing of the ventilator, the mechanical whine of the suction, and my steady, measured breathing as I held the general's life in the palm of my hand. Then, deep within my fingers, I felt it. A sudden, sharp, powerful contraction. The muscle beneath my palm tightened violently, kicking against my grip. Thump. I paused my hand, holding my breath. Thump, thump, thump. The general's heart surged back to life with a fierce, independent rhythm, beating heavily against my latex glove. On the overhead monitor, the chaotic, quivering line vanished. In its place, a crisp, beautiful, tall sinus rhythm spiked across the screen. Beep, beep, beep. Sinus rhythm restored. Helen screamed, a breathless, sobbing laugh escaping her throat. "Blood pressure is 98/62. Pulse is 68 and strong." "He's back!" Timmy shouted, slamming his fist onto the edge of the bed in pure triumph. "He's back!" I slowly, carefully withdrew my right hand from the general's chest. I looked down at my glove, covered in blood and iodine, and then at the steady, powerful rise and fall of the general's chest beneath the retractor. "Timmy," I said, my voice quiet, calm, and thick with exhaustion. "Let's wire that clavicle back together, place a fresh sterile drape, and close him up. Properly this time." "Yes, Commander," Timmy replied, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves with a proud, confident snap. I stepped back from the bed, stripping off my bloody gloves and tossing them into the bin. My arm muscles were burning from the intense exertion, but my hands were still completely steady. Captain Vance walked over to me, his eyes shiny with unshed tears. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, grabbed my shoulder, and squeezed it with enough force to bruise. His face carrying a gratitude so deep, no words in the English language could express it. Admiral Crane stepped up beside us, his phone still in his hand. He looked at the monitor, then at me, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "Clara, I've served in the Navy for 34 years. I have seen men awarded the Medal of Honor for doing less than what you just did in an ICU bay. He needed a pump, Admiral," I said simply, leaning my back against the cold wall to catch my breath. I was the only pump available. By 10 o'clock that morning, the storm over San Antonio had completely vanished, replaced by a brilliant, blazing Texas sun that turned the sky a vivid, endless blue. General Marcus Vance was fully closed, stable, and resting peacefully in Bay 4. His chest was securely wired, His arterial line was holding a perfect 112/70, and he was breathing comfortably on minimal ventilator support. Armed Navy guards remained posted at his door, but the atmosphere in the ICU had completely shifted from raw panic to quiet, triumphant relief. Down on the first floor, the hospital was undergoing a complete institutional transformation. Federal marshals and NCIS agents were wheeling boxes of confiscated files out of Arthur Pendleton's office. The executive board had been officially dissolved by order of the Department of Veterans Affairs, and an interim administrative team sent from Walter Reed was already setting up shop in the main concourse. At 11:30 a.m., Nurse Sarah Jenkins walked into the staff break room carrying a tray of fresh, hot coffee and a stack of printed memo pages. I was sitting at the corner table, wearing a clean navy scrub top, holding a warm cup in my hands. Beside me sat Dr. Timmy Miller and James Nakamura. "You're not going to believe this," Sarah said, setting the tray down and handing us the pages. "The VA Regional Director just released an official press statement. Arthur Pendleton and Harold Finch have been formally indicted by a federal grand jury on 24 counts of procurement fraud, evidence tampering, and medical endangerment." "What about their legal team's injunction?" Timmy asked, sipping his coffee. "Blown out of the water," James Nakamura chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. Once NCIS extracted those air-gapped files, the federal judge threw their motion out in 5 minutes. "Pendleton is being held without bail at the Federal Detention Center downtown." Timmy let out a low whistle. "Serves the bastard right. He spent 3 years destroying people's lives from behind a polished oak desk. He won't be seeing an oak desk for a very long time," Sarah said, sitting across from me. She looked at me, her eyes filled with deep warmth. "And there's more, Clara. The interim director just issued an emergency memo to all hospital staff. They've officially expunged every single negative mark, warning, and policy violation Pendleton ever entered into your personnel file." I looked down at the paper. My name, Dr. Clara Vance, was listed at the top, followed by a formal letter of commendation signed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. "It feels strange," I admitted softly, looking out the break room window at the sunny parking lot. "For 3 years, I tried so hard to keep my name out of official memos." "You don't have to hide anymore, Clara," Sarah said gently, reaching across the table to lay her hand over mine. "You saved this hospital." Before I could answer, the door to the break room opened. Captain Vance stepped inside, followed by Rear Admiral Thomas Crane. Both men were dressed in crisp, immaculate Navy uniforms, their brass buttons gleaming in the morning light. "Commander Vance," Admiral Crane said, his voice formal and authoritative. "The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is on a secure line in the conference room. He wishes to speak with you directly." I stood up, smoothing down my scrubs. "Lead the way, Admiral." We walked down the corridor toward the main administrative conference room. As we passed through the hallways, staff members, nurses, orderlies, janitors, and physicians stopped what they were doing and looked up. Some nodded in deep respect, others offered warm, quiet smiles. The atmosphere of fear that Arthur Pendleton had built over 3 years was completely gone, replaced by a sense of pride and relief that washed over the entire building. We entered the large conference room. At the far end of the room, mounted on the wall, a massive high-definition screen displayed the secure video seal of the Pentagon. Admiral Crane stepped up to the console and tapped a key. The seal vanished, replaced by the live video feed of General Thomas Sterling, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was sitting in his Pentagon office, flanked by 2 high-ranking Navy flag officers and a senior legal representative from the Department of Defense. "General Sterling," Admiral Crane said, snapping a sharp salute. "Commander Clara Vance is present." General Sterling looked through the camera, his sharp, dark eyes fixing directly on my face. He studied me for a long, silent moment. My simple Navy scrubs, my dark hair pulled back, my calm, unyielding posture. "Commander Vance." General Sterling's deep, gravelly voice echoed through the conference room speakers. "I have spent the last 3 hours reviewing 2 very different sets of documents. The first was the sealed file from Syria, 2023. The second was the real-time surgical report delivered by my medical team in San Antonio 30 minutes ago." He paused, resting his heavy hands on his desk. 3 years ago, Commander, General Sterling continued, his voice heavy with solemn gravity. A corrupt Joint Task Force commander used his political leverage to scapegoat you for his own tactical failures in Latakia. He buried your record, stripped your command, and forced one of the finest combat surgeons this country has ever produced into the shadows of a civilian night shift. I stood at attention, my hands at my sides, my face an unreadable mask. I did my duty, General. You did more than your duty, Commander, Sterling replied sharply. You saved 4 Navy SEALs under enemy mortar fire, and today, you saved General Marcus Vance's life twice in 3 hours, using procedures that most surgeons wouldn't dare attempt in a fully equipped operating theater. General Sterling stood up from his desk. The 2 flag officers beside him immediately stood up as well. By order of the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy, General Sterling announced, his voice ringing through the speakers with absolute historic weight. The 2023 court-martial findings against Commander Clara Vance are hereby completely annulled and expunged from all military archives. Your military medical record is fully restored, with a special presidential citation for heroic medical action under fire. A sharp, audible gasp escaped Sarah's throat from the doorway. Timmy clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes shining with tears. Furthermore, Commander, General Sterling continued, reaching down to open a leather folder on his desk. You are hereby promoted to the rank of Captain in the United States Navy Medical Corps, effective immediately. Captain Vance looked at me, a massive, proud grin spreading across his face. Admiral Crane gave a slow, deep nod of satisfaction. Captain Vance, General Sterling said, looking directly into the camera. The Navy owes you an apology that no words can ever fully express. We broke your career to cover up a lie, and you spent 3 years continuing to save lives in the dark, without a single word of complaint. He squared his shoulders and brought his hand up to his brow, delivering a crisp, rigid salute through the screen. Thank you for your service, Captain, Sterling said softly. Welcome back to the Navy. I stood straight, my feet together, my shoulders back. I raised my right hand to my brow and delivered a razor-sharp, flawless military salute back to the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Thank you, General, I said, my voice steady, clear, and proud. The video feed went dark with a soft chime, leaving the Pentagon seal glowing on the screen. The conference room was completely silent for a beat. Then, Timmy and Sarah burst into applause, coming over to hug me, while James Nakamura offered a firm, respectful handshake. Congratulations, Captain, James said, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile. It's about damn time. Thank you, James, I said, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in 3 long years. Admiral Crane walked up to me, pulling an official manila folder from his leather briefcase. He laid it open on the conference table in front of me. Inside the folder lay an official Department of Defense document, bearing the gold seal of the United States Navy. This is your official reassignment order, Clara, Admiral Crane said, his voice dropping into a quiet, serious tone. As a newly minted captain, you have a choice. The Pentagon has created a new position specifically for you. Chief of Tactical Trauma Operations at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. You'll have a multi-million-dollar budget, your own surgical team, and full authority over combat trauma protocols nationwide. I looked down at the document. It was everything any military surgeon could ever dream of. Power, prestige, unlimited resources, and the full backing of the United States government. And what is the second option, Admiral? I asked softly. Admiral Crane looked out the conference room window toward the main hospital concourse, where elderly veterans, active duty families, and young nurses were walking through the brightly lit halls. The second option, Crane said, a faint smile touching his lips, is staying right here at St. Jude VA Medical Center. The Department of Veterans Affairs has officially named this facility a National Regional Trauma Center. They need a permanent chief of surgery to rebuild this hospital from the ground up, to train the next generation of doctors, and to ensure that no veteran ever receives second-rate care again. He looked back at me, his sharp gray eyes searching my face. The choice is entirely yours, Captain Vance, Crane said. You can step back into the highest halls of military power, or you can stay here and build something new. I stood by the conference table, looking down at the official Navy document, then out the window at the sunny hallways of St. Jude. For 3 years, I had thought my life was defined by the rank I had lost and the career that had been buried in Syria. But standing there, looking at the faces of Timmy, Sarah, James, and the hundreds of veterans walking through those doors, I realized something far greater. My purpose had never been about a title, a rank, or a corner office in Bethesda. My purpose was right here, in the quiet hallways, in the emergency bays, and in the hands that held dying people together when everyone else gave up. I turned to Admiral Crane, my face illuminated by the bright Texas sun. "Admiral," I said, my voice completely steady, filled with absolute certainty. Tell the Pentagon that I'm staying right here." Admiral Crane didn't look surprised. A slow, respectful smile spread across his weathered face, and he picked up the reassignment papers, sliding them back into his leather briefcase. "I'll notify the Secretary's office immediately, Captain Vance. I have a feeling the VA Regional Director will be celebrating by nightfall." Captain Vance stepped forward, extending his right hand. The hard, exhausted lines on his face had softened completely. "St. Jude is getting the finest chief of surgery in the nation, Clara. My brother owes you his life, and so do I. If you ever need anything from Naval Special Warfare, anything at all, you just call my personal line." "Thank you, Captain," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "Tell General Vance I'll be in to check his chest tube drainage before my shift ends. He'll be waiting," Captain Vance said with a warm chuckle, though he'll probably complain about the hospital food first. As Admiral Crane and Captain Vance walked out of the conference room, I turned to look at the small group standing behind me. Nurse Sarah Jenkins was wiping away happy tears with the sleeve of her cardigan. Dr. Timmy Miller looked like a young man who had just been handed the keys to a brand new universe, his posture proud and straight. James Nakamura stood near the glass door, his arms crossed over his chest, a rare, quiet grin breaking through his stoic expression. "Chief of Surgery," Timmy whispered, shaking his head in absolute wonder. "Dr. Vance, Clara, Captain, what do we call you now?" I smiled, pulling my plain white lab coat tight over my navy scrubs. "In the operating room, you call me Captain or Chief. On the floor, Dr. Vance is just fine, but right now we have work to do." "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. "We need to rebuild this department from the ground up," I said, stepping past them into the sunlit administrative concourse. "I want a full inventory of every piece of surgical equipment in this building by 3 o'clock. Any discounted substandard blades or worn-out suction lines get thrown into the biohazard bin immediately. We are ordering military-grade trauma kits, fresh vascular grafts, and state-of-the-art monitoring units for every single bay." "Consider it done," James said, already pulling a tablet from his pocket to begin cataloging supplies. "I'll make sure the overnight prep room is restocked first. And Timmy," I added, looking at the young resident, "you're heading the morning ICU rounds with me. I want you to present General Vance's case to the incoming surgical residents as our primary teaching module." Timmy beamed, nodding enthusiastically. "Yes, Captain. I'll have his entire chart organized in 10 minutes. 4 months passed like a sudden shift in the wind. By late spring, St. Jude VA Medical Center looked like a completely different institution. The dark, fearful silence that had once defined Arthur Pendleton's regime was entirely gone. The faded, dusty photographs of corporate donors in the hallways had been replaced by clean, brightly lit display boards showing photos of staff members, recovered veterans, and training milestones. The turnover rate among nurses and junior doctors had dropped by 70%. Staff members walked down the corridors with their heads held high, their voices in morning briefings filled with active suggestions and clinical questions rather than silent, terrified compliance. The hospital had officially been designated the St. Jude Regional Veteran Trauma Institute, operating under a direct federal grant that ensured top-tier equipment, fair wages, and absolute administrative transparency. Arthur Pendleton and Harold Finch had both been formally tried in federal district court. Faced with the overwhelming, air-gapped evidence extracted from Pendleton's private drive, both men entered guilty pleas to charges of federal procurement fraud, systematic falsification of medical records, and obstruction of justice. Pendleton was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole, his medical license permanently revoked nationwide. Finch lost his entire corporate portfolio, stripped of his board standing and sentenced to 7 years for his financial participation in the scheme. Their legacy of fear was reduced to a cautionary tale taught in hospital administration courses across the country. On a warm, clear Tuesday morning in May, I stood in Operating Suite 1. The room was pristine, illuminated by brilliant, shadowless LED surgical lamps. Surrounding the stainless steel operating table were 6 young surgical residents in clean green scrubs, their eyes wide with intense focus as they watched my hands. On the table lay a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran requiring a complex femoral popliteal arterial bypass to save his left leg. "Notice the tissue plane here, Dr. Miller," I said, my voice calm, clear, and carrying through the quiet suite. I was using a fine-tipped forceps to expose the delicate vascular bundle beneath the muscle. In textbook scenarios, the tissue is clean and predictable. But in veterans who have suffered old blast trauma or scar tissue, you have to read the resistance with your fingertips before you make a single cut. Timmy, who had been promoted to chief surgical resident 2 weeks prior, leaned in close, guiding a second pair of forceps with steady, confident hands. "Feel the pulsation above the adhesion first," Timmy explained to the younger residents beside him, echoing the exact words I had taught him months ago. "Anticipate the vessel retraction before you apply the clamp." "Precisely," I said, giving Timmy an approving nod. "Take the needle driver, Timmy. You're placing the primary anastomosis." Timmy took the instrument without a second of hesitation. His hands, which had once shaken so violently over a basic airway tray in Emergency Bay 4, were now completely steady, executing delicate, microscopic vascular sutures with fluid, practiced precision. I stepped back from the table, stripping off my outer gloves, watching him work. I felt a quiet, profound sense of pride swell in my chest. This was what medicine was supposed to be. Not a battlefield of egos, budgets, and intimidation, but a sacred handoff of knowledge, skill, and human compassion from one generation of healers to the next. After the 2-hour procedure concluded successfully, I walked out of the surgical wing and headed down to the 4th-floor intensive care unit for afternoon rounds. As I pushed through the double-glass doors of the ICU, I heard a familiar, boisterous voice laughing from Bay 4. General Marcus Vance was sitting upright in a comfortable armchair beside his bed, dressed in a sharp, crisp civilian suit. He looked healthy, robust, and full of life, his skin carrying a deep tan from his recent fishing trip on the Texas coast. Sitting across from him was his younger brother, Captain Vance, along with Nurse Sarah Jenkins, who was setting a fresh cup of decaf coffee on his tray table. "I'm telling you, Sarah, the doctors at Walter Reed almost lost their minds when they did my follow-up echo last month," General Vance was saying with a loud, booming laugh. "The chief of cardiology pulled up my scans and asked who built that internal mammary bridge in my chest. When I told him it was done in an unsterile ICU room by a doctor using her hands as a pump, he nearly choked on his coffee." "General Vance," I said, walking into the bay with a smile, "I see your blood pressure is probably spiking from telling tall tales again." General Vance immediately stood up from his chair. Despite his 4 stars and his high standing in the Pentagon, he squared his shoulders, stood at rigid attention, and offered me a sharp, formal military salute. Captain Vance stood beside him, matching his brother's salute perfectly. "Captain Vance," General Vance said, his blue eyes shining with warmth and deep, eternal respect. "Always a pleasure to see the woman who kept my heart beating." I returned their salute with a crisp, practiced motion of my right hand. "At ease, General. How is the chest feeling?" "Stronger than ever, Clara," Marcus said, relaxing back into his chair with a wide smile. "I brought you something from Washington." He reached onto the side table and picked up a heavy, polished mahogany box lined with dark blue velvet. He opened the brass latch and handed it to me. Inside the velvet box lay a gleaming, solid silver medallion, stamped with the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs, surrounded by the gold-embossed lettering of the Presidential Award for Extraordinary Civilian and Military Medical Service. Beside the medal lay an official parchment document signed directly by the President of the United States, officially naming the St. Jude Regional Veteran Trauma Institute as a national center of excellence. "The vice chairman wanted me to deliver that personally," Marcus said softly. "The president signed the executive decree yesterday morning. This hospital now has guaranteed federal funding for the next 20 years. I held the heavy mahogany box in my hands, tracing the polished brass edges. For 3 years, I had worked in the dark, believing that my career was a ghost, and that my impact would forever be confined to the forgotten hours of the night shift. But looking at that silver medal, and then looking out the bay window at the bustling, vibrant halls of St. Jude, I realized that every single moment of struggle had led to this exact reality. "Thank you, Marcus," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "This belongs to every nurse, doctor, and staff member who stood up in this building when it mattered most. It belongs to you, Clara," Sarah Jenkins said, coming over to wrap her arm gently around my shoulder. "You showed us how to stand." Later that evening, as the golden Texas sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson, purple, and amber, I walked down to the first-floor main entrance. The night shift was just beginning to arrive. Fresh groups of nurses in crisp blue scrubs were checking in at the front desk, laughing and chatting as they grabbed their assignment sheets. Orderlies were pushing clean supply carts down the bright, wide concourse. The air smelled of clean floor wax, fresh coffee, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a hospital that was truly healing. I walked out through the automatic glass doors and stepped onto the wide front plaza. The warm evening breeze blew softly against my face, carrying the sweet scent of blooming Texas jasmine from the manicured gardens out front. I walked to the edge of the plaza, leaning my hands against the cool stone railing, looking out over the vast, sparkling lights of San Antonio, stretching out toward the distant hills. I unbuttoned my plain white lab coat and pulled my small leather notebook from my pocket. I opened it to the very last page. For 3 years, I had filled this book with time-stamped records of survival, secret surgical interventions, and quiet notes written in the dark. I pulled a pen from my pocket, turned to the final blank line at the bottom of the page, and wrote a single, final entry. May 12th. St. Jude Regional Veteran Trauma Center. All bays clear. All patients stable. The shadows are gone. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked down at my hands, my steady, strong hands that had held a dull scalpel in a flickering bay, that had clamped an aorta in an emergency suite, and that had manually pumped a 4-star general's heart back to life in the dark. True authority didn't come from an administrative title, a $1,000 suit, or a polished oak desk. It didn't come from fear, intimidation, or forcing good people into silence. True authority lived in the quiet, unyielding courage of a person who refused to step back when a life was on the line, who stood as a shield for those who couldn't protect themselves, and who brought light into the darkest places simply by choosing not to leave. I took a deep, peaceful breath of the warm Texas air, turned around, and walked back through the bright glass doors into the bustling hospital. My shift was starting, and I had lives to save.